Alright. Hello everybody, welcome back to Card Shop Simulator. I'm going to be continuing the audiobook where we left off.
Bright flares pulling away from the enemy.
An ad. Where did we leave off? Here we go.
Fire main lanceres. Ravening white spears of pure power stabbed at the foe, tearing red glowing gouges across its hull. Globs of molten metal spun away,
I remember there's probably
and flames leapt from the wounds. The Grand Cruiser lurched visibly under the impacts and began to twist away from the salvo.
Steam.
Even as it did so, two heat trails appeared from behind the Grand Cruiser, coming up fast to slash at its rear with a spiraling net of laser bolts. Nathan felt a rush of relief. The other two ships must be allies, and now their mutual enemy was caught between two fires. Below, the gunners were rushing to reload Balthazar for another shot, while a small team struggled to pin a whipping power line which sparked furiously. He looked back at the lens in time to see a swarm of bright flares pulling away from the enemy cruiser's prow, ominously. The tiny heat trails curved to alter course towards them, and it soon became apparent that although these new weapons were not as fast as the projectiles fired before, they were considerably bigger. Sirens blared. All stations prepare to repel boarders. The relief Nathan had felt rapidly evaporated. The enemy must have launched boarding torpedoes, simple attack craft packed with troops, bombs, incendiaries, corrosives, nerve agents and other hellish weapons necessary to wreak havoc if they got abroad. It was bad enough to be caught up in the titanic duel between warships, but now the enemy was coming to strike at them face to face, all the time with the prospect of being crushed like an insect by the pulverising contest going on outside. Isaiah rapidly passed out weapons from an arms locker. Blades, shock mauls, stubby auto pistols and chunky shotguns. Nathan found himself equipped with a worn-looking pump gun and a clip of shells. He risked a glance at the window as he was fumbling to slot the shot-filled cylinders into the breech of the gun. They now showed finger-long missiles with beaked brows, powering, as it seemed, straight for him on harsh coronas of light. The sirens blared a repeating four-tone alarm. Port turret stations, open fire! Nathan cursed as he dropped a shell onto the grating. His fingers felt like sausages in the thick suit gloves. Outside, lasers sketched livid traceries across the void as the short-range turrets laid down their barrage. Shells and missiles exploded in gouts of orange incendiaries as the Retribution's barbettes joined in. The first rank of the big projectiles were consumed or broken open, and tiny struggling figures spilled into the void as they spiraled away. But still, more torpedoes surged through the barrage and angled in, cutting their flaring drives on a final approach. Nathan slammed the last shell into place and carefully pumped the action to chamber a round. At the last instant before impact, the torpedoes appeared to swell enormously, becoming as big as shuttles before they disappeared from view. A ringing impact threw Nathan to the quivering deck, and an endless cacophony of screaming, tearing metal followed. It was so loud it made him quell at the bone-crushing violence of it, of the sheer force that was ripping through meters of armour plate to breach the hull. Finally, the tearing slowed and stopped until only the screams of injured gunners and the hiss of escaping air penetrated Nathan's helmet. The Opticon deck had twisted, and now part of it sagged away towards the lower deck. Nathan crawled to the edge and saw there was terrible carnage. A great crocodile snout of steel and brass projected through the hull plates near Balthazar's breech. Deck plates were twisted back. Stanchions and pipes had been bent into an insane ironwork jungle with flowers of steam and spraying fluids. The surviving gunners were taking up defensive positions, aiming their assortment of shotguns and pistols at the invaders. As they did so, cannons coughed into life around the crocodile's snout. Gun flashes strobed as auto weapons hammered explosive rounds across the interior of the gunroom. Men were blasted asunder where the rounds struck, and hot shrapnel wickered around the metal hulls, injuring others. The snout was grinding open now, and a horde of nightmarish figures spilled out to add their fire to the fight. At first they appeared like men in the flicker of light, but their insane glee marked them apart. They capered as the gunners pitifully few weapons tore into them, filling that crocodile maw with twitching bodies. They roared with mad laughter as they blazed back with their own guns and threw devilish bombs which burst into pools of hungry, incandescent flame. Nathan sighted on a twisted figure as it pulled back its arms and fled. The pump gun crashed, and the figure fell into a burning pool of its own making. The flames spread, engulfed the crocodile snout and the next two who tried to rush through were eaten alive by the incendiary. Even so, a group of the attackers were out in the gunroom now, dashing through the wreckage to hurl themselves at the gunners. Vicious hand-to-hand combat broke out across the deck, the foe's hooks and crooked blades crashing against the gunners' pry bars and line gaps.
For that guy.
The pump gun was useless now. The melee had reduced all ordered fighting to a shambles. "We've got to help them," Nathan shouted to Kron. Kron's helm nodded ponderously back, and they both slid themselves down the twisted Opticon deck to drop down onto the gun deck.
I do know that.
Asaya and two other survivors of the Opticon crew followed, and they waded into the brawl in a loose knot. Nathan used his gun as a club, smashing the skull of a black-clad figure who was about to gut a fallen gunner. He winced as the gun crunched into its misshapen head, fearing the aging weapon would fall apart in his hands. He pumped the action to chamber a round to reassure himself it still could, just as two figures leapt at him out of the smoke. Their mad eyes glared from behind leather hoods, looking so like fetching that Nathan almost hesitated before he blasted one in the midriff with the shotgun. He pumped the slide to chamber another round, but it jammed halfway. Cursing, he swung the gun up to block a saw-bladed knife as the other foe slashed at him, but he was borne back as his attacker leapt bodily into him, pinning the useless gun between their bodies. Panic stole Nathan's strength as he struggled against this maniacal attack. Drool spilled across his face as the creature tore away his helmet with its free hand and pushed him to the deck. Nathan dropped his gun and scrabbled to keep a grip on the knife hand as his foe leaned its weight against it, pushing it inexorably towards his exposed neck. For a long second, Nathan saw every detail of the thing astride him with horrible clarity. Flames billowed behind a head made jagged by short horns thrusting out through its leather mask. Cartilage-textured tubes twisted in and out of its flesh like parasitical worms. It was either naked or covered in human hides marked with brands and stigmata. It stank like a week-old corpse, and it muttered mad, excited prayers as it bent to the task of murdering him. If what he'd been told was true, this thing must have been human once. Every shred of its humanity was gone now, eaten up by insane gods that had reduced it to living offal that worshipped its own butcher. Sickness lent Nathan an awful strength, a burning desire to wipe out these horrors that had been unleashed on them. With a supreme effort born of revulsion, Nathan shoved the creature back. Suddenly, it convulsed, then slumped, and its dead weight bore him down again. Nathan rolled free to see Kron pulling an axe from the abomination's neck. Isaiah and the others had disappeared into smoke. Only corpses surrounded Nathan and Kron. Nathan's helmet visor had been smashed, rendering it useless. Without it, he realised how thin the air was becoming. The flames all around were turning ghostly as they hungrily ate at what remained. Even the screams and sounds of combat were becoming subtly muffled. "We have to stop them getting aboard!" Kron shouted to him from his own damnably intact helmet. Nathan nodded his understanding, grabbing up some firebombs from the corpse and found a short halberd from among the fallen, before heading for the heart of the inferno. He felt filled with a kind of righteous fury at the turn of events. Like things couldn't get any worse and it was time for some payback. Somebody had to pay for him landing in a situation as dire as this, and with Kendrickson already dead, it was going to have to be their insane, murderous enemy. The snout stood open as before. The flames were dying away in its maw, and Nathan could see more twisted figures gathering to rush through. He fumbled to find an activation stud on the rune-etched bomb before giving up and simply lobbing it as the figures started to run forward. Then another and a third from Kron, turning the entryway into a sea of corrosive fire as the bombs burst on impact. Nathan turned to shout to Kron, an instant before an armoured giant burst through the conflagration with a brazen roar. Before Nathan could react, the heavy pistol in its fist barked twice and Kron was thrown back with a flash and a shower of blood. Nathan felt an icy bolt of fear trying to force his feet to run, but it was already too late. The figure charged forward with nightmarish speed, an ironclad monster of myth, skull-helmed and laden with death, a screeching chainsword in its other fist, slashing down at him in an unstoppable arc. Nathan hurled himself aside and brought up the halberd to block the slash. It was a mistake. The power of the blow threw him back, jolting his arms as the shrieking teeth of the saw tore chunks from the halberd's steel haft in a shower of sparks. The giant wielded its huge blade with ease, and in a blink of an eye, its shrieking blade circled and swept down at him again. Nathan leapt back, but the sweep of the chainsword tore the head from the halberd and slid along the arm of his suit, chewing through it and tearing at his flesh. A cold flush of painlessness told Nathan that the injury was severe. His body was already trying to shut out the agony. In desperation, Nathan thrust the jagged end of the halberd into the thing's barrel chest. It rang off an armoured plate and buried itself deep in a nest of cables beneath where its ribs should have been. The giant warrior didn't even flinch as it sent him sprawling with a blow from its heavy pistol. Death was close. One of his eyes was blind, and Nathan felt an abnormal calm as he accepted that these were his last seconds of life. The world seemed to slow to an instant crawl as the armoured warrior stepped towards him, raising its keening sword for a killing blow. Nathan felt only a pang of disappointment that he would never know more of Kron's strange wisdom. So much must have died with him. The pounding of Nathan's last heartbeats sounded like a distantly thumping drum. Thump. One armoured boot crunched down. Flecks of blood span away from the motion-captured teeth of the chainsword as it soared upwards. Nathan looked down at his right arm and saw it was crimson from shoulder to wrist. Everything wavered as he started to black out. Thump. The other boot crashed down. The blade was raised almost to the top of its arc. Nathan was aware of movement where Kron had fallen, and a tiny spark of hope flared that he might still be alive, might save Nathan somehow, if only he was quick and could defeat this unstoppable colossus. Logic sneered at his paltry hopes from the dark recesses of his brain. Thump. The blade began to sweep down, gathering momentum. Nathan's world was shrinking, the vision from his remaining eye darkening until he could barely see. Paltry hopes and unconscious thoughts were corroded away by the sea of agony raging through his arm. Thump. Nathan saw the blade had entered his dimmed world, and part of him welcomed it. Teeth flashing bright as a shark's hungry smile in the gloom. The pain would be over soon. That could only be good. A spectral hand seemed to be reaching over him to touch the blade, as if the God Emperor himself were placing a benediction on his slaughter. The hand was crawling with blue fires and sparks cascading from its fingertips. Thump. A flash of light leapt from hand to blade, and with it the chainsword exploded, and it was hurled away from the giant's fist. The hulking warrior staggered and started to raise his pistol. Kron stepped forward into Nathan's circle of vision and raised the hand. Thump. A ravening bolt of brilliance crackled from Kron's hand onto the warrior's chestplate and rent it asunder in a thunderclap. The mighty figure was thrown off its feet, its pistol sending explosive rounds flashing off wildly from its owner's convulsing death spasms. Thump. The chainsword, molten and twisted, rang down on the deck plates. Nathan clasped his left arm to his right shoulder and instantly felt warmth flood through his blood-slick wounds. The armoured warrior crashed to the deck beside its smoking sword. Nathan tried to breathe more deeply to clear his head, but found he couldn't. The orange flames all around were shrinking into bluish flickers. The air was nearly gone. Kron squatted down beside him as the ship shook, as if from some internal explosion. Nathan could see the chest of Kron's suit was shredded and bloody. A death shot, surely. Wreckage dislodged by the shockwave crashed down nearby with horrible clangor. Kron didn't even flinch as he calmly removed his helmet. As the helmet came away, Kron's eye blazed as never before. It was glowing with the fierce light of a furnace. Nathan tried to blot out the horrible intensity of the glare in his dimmed world, but couldn't. It poured into him, so that it seemed like Kron the man was shrunk to nothing more than a wraith, that the crimson brilliance trailed behind him like smoke. Kron's lips moved, but Nathan had to strain to hear their faint whisper through the rarefied air. Don't you worry, shipmate. Kron'll see to you. Lumen! Nathan gasped. No, Kron whispered. Nathan's body was trembling uncontrollably as shock set in. His vision had almost dimmed completely, apart from a harsh red light floating nearby. Not at all. A helmet clamped down over Nathan's head, dimming the light and bringing a welcome darkness. Nathan awoke on the floor of the hidden cutter. His arm was in a sling, and a bandage covered one of his eyes, but he otherwise felt rested and healthy. Kron was sitting in one of the narrow pews, watching him. How'd you feel? He inquired with genuine concern. Good, Nathan grunted as he sat up. How long was I out? 5 hours. I took time to fix you up, and me too, and rest some, while we go back up to the gun room. Nathan felt a sense of relief. He had feared Kron would ask him if he wanted to jump ship. The aftermath of a battle offered the best chance Nathan would likely get for an escape to go unnoticed. But somehow, the prospect seemed a lot less appealing now he had seen what was out there, waiting for mutineers and faithless men to fall into its clutches. In fact, Nathan was feeling an unfamiliar amount of regard for the God Emperor after his experiences, a craving for the protection the Ecclesiarchs promised could be granted from the blessing of the Holy Master of mankind. But that left him in here with Kron. Not a looming Kron who could defeat a champion of the mad gods with his own lightning. No ordinary gunner, for sure. A servant of the Emperor? Somehow Nathan didn't think so. If anything, he really did look like a gargoyle in this setting, a red-eyed piece of malevolence that had detached itself from the stonework and come down to blaspheme among it. Perhaps someone hiding out then, disguised among a faceless mass, yet always moving from one world to another. It would be a superb cover, unremarkable, beneath attention, and yet guarded by the awesome might of an Imperial warship. Ultimately, whatever other misgivings Nathan might have, Kron had saved his life, and that put him firmly in Kron's debt. He began to say so, but Kron waved his thanks away. Don't be too thankful, lad. I had to fix your eye with what was to hand down here. I'm afraid I might have made a terrible job out of it. Take the bandage off. Tell me if you can see. Nathan knew what was coming even before his fingers brushed cold steel around his eye. The lens of it was hard and slightly curved to the touch. He bore metal-sealed scars of his first engagement as part of the Emperor's navy, but his vision was perfect. Nathan shuddered as he recalled Kron's unnerving personality shift after the fight with Kendrickson, when he had seemed like a slave, desperate to escape his inactive bionic eye.
My food's ready.
Kron,
I'll be right
Nathan
back.
began tentatively. Who are you really? Kron chortled. A princeling who was stolen by gypsies. Don't start that again. Very well. I'll put it this way, lad. Cross the stars and fight for glory. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's taken longer than I thought because it was a longer story than I thought, and hopefully it's a reasonable job. If you'd like to support the channel, please use the...
Alright, I'll be right back. lunch. Alright, I got food.
Evil.
I'm just getting hit by ad by ad by ad. There we go.
Let the Galaxy Burn. Narrated by a Border Prince. Cross the stars and hope for glory, but wear the heavens' wrath. Take your salt and hear a shipman's story. Listen to tales of the Gulf, of stars that sing and worlds that lie beyond the ghosts of the rim. But remember, lads, there ain't no words for every void-born thing. Shipman's Labour Chant, Gothic Sector, Segmentum Obscurus. Ancient History by Andy Chambers. Nathan ran down the stinking alley, panting and sweating.
Getting water.
He could hear shouts and a scuffle behind him as they pounced on Kendrickson. His mind raced faster than his feet across the cracked slabs. Poor old Kendrickson. Still, better him than me. He leapt over a prostrate body, almost invisible in the darkness, as the irony of the situation struck home. At least, that's the last time he'll try to get me killed. At the corner, he risked a glance back. A lone street loom cast a pool of yellow light over a scene that looked suspiciously like one from some Ministorum morality play. 4 burly, shaven-headed men in dun-coloured coveralls were hauling Kendrickson to his feet. He seemed unduly surprised, nay stunned, to be cast in the starring role of the eponymous incautious reveller, laid low by local ruffians, cultists, or worse. Surely a punishment from the God Emperor for his carelessness and self-indulgence. The image was shattered when the officer stepped out from the shadows to congratulate the men on their catch. Nathan had never seen an Imperial naval officer before, but he had no doubt that he was looking at one now. Tall, poised, immaculately dressed in a tailored uniform coat and a pair of glossy black boots, which had probably never trodden the dust of the planet for more than a few hours. He would surely be a junior officer to be in charge of a gang like that, trawling through the back alleys of Junip Town to fill out some labour team aboard his ship. Junior or not, he radiated the absolute assuredness that only generations of breeding and a lifetime of training engenders. Nathan started to back away as his mind raced on. There were rumours that Imperial ships would come from Port Moore to Leith, but everyone said that sort of thing when there was a war among the stars. Half the people hoped the fleet would come and save them from Sanctus knows what, while the other half were afraid that the fleet would bring the war to their doorstep. Nobody had ever thought that the Navy would come to steal a tithe of men and take them away on their ships.
Wait, didn't I just listen to this?
Men
one?
who, if only half the stories were true, would never be seen again. Kendrickson was off for a cruise, and there was nothing Nathan could do about it. He certainly didn't intend taking on a press gang single-handed.
Let me see.
Muffled. "We have to stop them getting aboard!" Crunch. The protection the Ecclesiarchs promised could be granted from the blessing of the Holy Master of mankind. But fight for glory. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. It's taken longer than I thought because it was a longer story than I thought.
Yeah, that's it.
No living being.
There we are. Weird.
Let the Galaxy Burn. Narrated by a Border Prince. Tenebrae. Chinks of reddish-grey glow filtering between eddies in the layer of atmospheric debris announced the break of dawn over Tenebrae's capital. The city, known as Wormwood, had stood for the past 50 years of the 700th century of the 41st millennium. Now Wormwood was dying. The screams of men mingled with the gibbering of demons and the thunder of weapons. Upset by the warping influence of chaos, gates opening to provide access to creatures who had no rightful place in the material world, the burgeoning clouds over the city periodically rained blood, sometimes toads, upon the death-strewn streets. The old man strode with uncharacteristic haste through the looming, vaulted halls and thoroughfares of the Adeptus Arbites fortress of Wormwood's war-torn central plaza. Governor Dane Cortez reflected that the pandemonium within the building was almost as distressing as the chaos without. An aging man, he nevertheless carried his tall, thin frame with authority. His hawk-like features, coupled with the resplendent robes of his office, which billowed in his wake, lent him an air of power and mystique. This was but a well-practiced front, providing a facade of strength to a man inwardly broken and in turmoil. All around Cortez, the subjects of his planet, his charges, panicked and fled before the unholy invaders. Even now, within this very building, the Arbites struggled to order the evacuation of civilians to a heavily defended landing platform on the roof of the great edifice. This final chapter in his personal catastrophe was almost too much for Cortez's aging heart to bear, but he knew he must appear strong in the face of adversity if there was to be any hope for the survivors. Striding through the hall of his inauguration, the milling citizens of Tenebrae parted to allow Governor Cortez passage. Amazing, he thought. Even in the hour of my greatest failure, they continue to show me deference. At his heels, a constant 2 steps behind, trotted his vulpine advisor, Frayne. The snivelling wretch burbled a continuous stream of sycophantic and unctuous nonsense, which the governor had long since learned to politely ignore. As they passed underneath yet another cyclopean archway on their way to the fortified command chamber express elevator, a commotion caught Cortez's attention in the ornate hallway. A young man had somehow wrestled the bolt pistol from the holster of one of the grim-faced Arbites. Before the security men could stop him, he sprayed his wife and their infant son, cutting them down where they stood, white-faced and terrified. As the lawmen descended on the wretch with their power mauls, he used the space cleared around him to turn the weapon on himself. The man's chest erupted into a fine red mist as he pumped the deadly explosive bolts into his own torso. Cortez closed the lift doors on this scene of carnage and felt his inner spark wither a little more inside him. The ancient elevator shuddered into life and began its rapid ascent. "One more heretic bloodline severed. Praise the Emperor," Frayne remarked in what he obviously considered his most superior fashion. The 2 heavily armed guards in the lift maintained their statuesque stoicism. Cortez regarded Frayne with open disgust, earnestly hoping that the insidious man did not mistake his own expression as contempt for those poor people who now lay dead. Dead because of their superiors' complacency. Because of my own complacency, Cortez mentally corrected himself. Arriving at the relative safety of the command chamber, Cortez ordered Frayne and his guards to evacuate with the rest. He would remain to put his affairs in order. Frayne protested, just enough to escape possible future recrimination, Cortez noted, but was summarily ignored. He too eagerly joined the evacuation of the rest of Wormwood's code administration, leaving the governor to his own counsel. The command chamber was spacious, and Cortez noted abstractly that for now at least the generators still worked. Bright strip lighting threw a sterile, artificial glare from the polished white surfaces of the fittings. Dane Cortez moved slowly towards the broad window to watch the horror unfold. Chaos and heresy engulfed his home before his stricken eyes. Cortez realized that he must present a forlorn figure gazing wistfully from his eyrie, and he desperately attempted to maintain his tall and dignified bearing, despite the terrible events which had overtaken him. Cortez had served his time in the military, reaching the exalted rank of commander, fighting on 100 planets in a dozen systems. But with time, he had sickened of war, and in the final years of his military career, he had begun to realise that he needed a measure of peace to discover himself. By then, his influence had not been entirely insubstantial, so strings had been pulled, and the name of Tanabray had been mentioned. Tanabray. The planet had seemed ideal at the time, and Cortez had thought that securing the governorship would solve all of his problems. Standing at the impressive window, Cortez laughed ironically to himself. There was, after all, no one else to hear him. In the street below,
so close.
the horrible hissing and popping of plasma-cooked bodies mingled with the screams of the wounded to teach the old man above the meaning of fear. Far above the streets, a cold and unhealthy train of thoughts flooded the mind of Tanabray's ruler with uncomfortable clarity.
Why won't it?
Perhaps there is no escape, he mused, plucking absently at the ornate brocade of his cuffs. Life itself is fear. The universe is fear. And vitality itself naught but a morbid energy, fed by the joyous relief that it is the next man who is dead and not oneself. Tears flowed down the pain-racked cheeks of an old and broken man. Is fear of death the only joy of life? Shocked by his own thoughts, Cortez felt strangely ashamed by his obscure revelation, for he was yet a man with a military background and still found it difficult to surrender to fear. Now I truly am a man alone, and yes, I am afraid, he muttered, the terror fluttered within his heart. As explosions racked the palace, the screams of the dead and the dying reached even through the reinforced windows of his chamber. Their leader stood immobile. Cortez's eyes looked on, but his anguished mind was lost in distant thought as he tried to wrest some solace from the comfort of memory. Cortez's mind groped back through the years to the first days of his affair with Tanabray. A harsh mistress indeed, and given to treachery at last, he whispered, his mind drifting ever on. He recalled those first impressive documents, records he studied earnestly in preparation for his posting as governor and owner. Even now, to recite the text, it had become a shallow litany to him, bereft of all meaning other than the comfort brought by the repetition of familiar words. Tanabray. 45 light years from Fenris, the ancient bulwark of the space walls. Tanabray, in the Prometheus star system. Tanabray, the planet of eternal darkness. Cortez gripped the guardrail at the window as terror washed deeply over him. In truth, he knew that Tanabray was nothing more than a world which should never have borne life at all. Perhaps, in the very act of settling this world, the Imperium had transgressed into areas best left untouched. Unbidden, the words flowed like a prayer in sibilant mutterings from his thin lips. Tanabray, a world a mere 180 million miles from Prometheus, a Class A supergiant which burns 10,000 times more brightly than Sol, the sun that brought life to terror itself. Tanabray. At some point in its eon-shrouded past, a miracle befell the scorched rock of the planet. A meteor struck, throwing a thick pall of ash and
Why
vapour
won't it?
into Tenebrae's thin atmosphere. Tenebrae, protected by a tender blanket of thick ash clouds from the worst of Prometheus's destructive radiations.
Finally.
Tenebrae. The stage was set for oceans to form and the theatre of life to perform its first acts. Cortez wiped an unsteady hand across his pale and sweaty forehead. The words brought no comfort. None at all. Maybe it was always a trap. The hand of chaos guiding even that fateful meteorite. The old governor stumbled from his vantage point, his mind in turmoil. Instinctively, he sought solace at his great desk, hands automatically sorting through the jumble of papers in his desk drawers, even as his mind whirled through uncontrollable planes. He smiled wanly at the mass of agricultural data before him. 10 years of research, utterly irrelevant now, just memories of better times. Cortez shuffled through the records of colonizing scientists, reading as if for the first time about the eyeless, slug-like worms which crawled in the anaerobic filth of Tenebrae's shorelines. Creatures which were the planet's best evolutionary effort in the absence of sunlight. While Plasma licked hungrily at the walls of his bastion, Cortez absently scanned through the lengthy reports about the sulphurous algae trees, glowing in tide pools, in their own leprous light. The planetary overlord toyed with his ornate letter opener. He considered that in truth, for such an apparently drab and lacklustre world, Mistress Tenebrae had proved that she harboured terrible dangers for the unwary. He considered, not for the first time, whether her proximity to the Eye of Terror, abominable gateway to the heart of chaos, had sealed her fate. Was it this which had whispered the many temptations and terrors into his dreams? And were those nightmares long established in the hearts of the dispirited inhabitants of the planet of eternal darkness by the time his governorship had commenced? An explosion rocked the palace, and a once valuable glass ornament tumbled from its marble plinth to shatter into countless fragments. Cortez barely shrugged as the spray of razor shards brought scarlet droplets to his forehead. "Yes," he muttered. "She sold her soul long before my time." A colossal, rhythmic pounding started outside. The governor's attention tore away from his reminiscences, and he scurried back to the window to see what new horror transpired in the streets below. Lumbering past the window of Cortez's shelter, with strides which easily cleared the small buildings, Tenebrae's Emperor-class Titan pounded through the city. "Prosperitas looks," Cortez snorted ironically. It was typical to name such a war machine on a recently colonized world thus, the hopes and delusions of the people it served to defend reflected in its title. Prosperitas Lux had not been scrambled quickly enough to be effective against the invasion, and had consequently failed in its protective capacity. Now it must surely fall, along with the rest of the world. "As with everything else in this sorry situation," Cortez moaned, "it is me, my own indecision, which is to blame." While the problem had still been a civil matter of heretics and malcontents rioting upon the streets of Wormwood, Cortez had been unwilling to send in the guard. He preferred instead to leave such matters for the Arbites to resolve. "Idiot! Blind, stupid idiot!" Repeatedly cursing himself for a fool, Cortez came to the bitterest conclusion. The conclusion that his ineffective governorship was the primary cause of their defeat. He gazed in wide-eyed desperation as the hulking form receded from view, trying to deny the evidence of his eyes. The Titan was listing badly, flames gouting from its hull. Greenish clouds of plasma periodically vented from the carapace, and Cortez well knew that this indicated a catastrophic reactor breach. From his fortified window, the governor could see the tiny faces of the proud crew flash past, mouthing oaths of fear and anguish. He knew the machine was doomed along with all the souls on board. "Doomed as my planet," he groaned aloud. At last, he acknowledged that this situation was down to him. the great Governor Dane Cortez, and in the end, the responsibility had proven too much. Even now, facing utter defeat at the hands of warped creatures from the very abyss, Cortez could not stop the flood of hateful memories which assaulted his mind. Amidst the papers strewing his desk, Cortez's laden eyes fell on the long-ignored Adeptus Arbites reports of cult activity. The unbelievable reports of chaos worship, which had so swiftly burgeoned from a couple of isolated incidents in the wastelands into a full-scale heretical rebellion, stared back at him. Undeniable evidence of his inaction. "The signs were all here, he wailed, scattering the reports from his desk with a sweep of his hand. In the secret place of his heart, Cortez long knew that Tenebrae bred a certain dissolution of the senses. He had felt the lassitude of the spirit, which left such sophisticated life forms as humans craving sensation. Perhaps, Cortez supposed, such a biologically primitive environment resulted in a correspondingly underdeveloped spiritual climate. Whatever the reasons, the passing of his years of governorship on Tenebrae had seen the worship of the Emperor slide further and further into meaningless abstraction, and the whispers from the Eye of Terror grow ever more strident. Now the end was upon him, Cortez could see clearly why it had happened. He derived small comfort from the knowledge that there wasn't a thing he could have done about it, but that did not excuse him of his responsibilities. Cortez was certain that in the eyes of mankind he would be held culpable, perhaps even complicit in the disaster which had befallen his planet. "They'll make their own excuses," Cortez groaned, aware that elsewhere in the galaxy, the powers of the Imperium would doubtless create their own unfavourable subtext for why he had not undertaken the obvious and lawful course of action. That is to say, why he had not called upon the Inquisition. "Heretic Cortez," he wailed. "Cortez, thrall of chaos." Cortez tortured himself with such thoughts of how history would perceive him, for he was yet merely human, and subject to human pride. Losing Tenebrae was one thing, losing his life another, but losing his name and dignity too? Slumping wearily into his great padded chair of office, Cortez remembered the day when vast Baroque battle barges, covered in the hateful iconography of the Chaos Gods, had appeared from the warp to hang silently over Tenebrae's atmosphere. They had rained fleets of jagged landing craft towards the planet's surface. Now the payload of those death carriers stalked the streets of Wormwood, twisted, malevolent machines and beings who left tragedy and ruin and terror in their wake. "Why? Tell me why?" Cortez implored the empty air. "This backwater planet may not mean much, but it is my home." Despair overcame him, and anguished gulping sobs racked his aged frame. "Why did I ever come here? Why?" When he had been offered the governorship of this world so many years ago, he had taken it gladly. A small backwater world of little importance, a place to be happy and untroubled, a place to put his memories of military service and the horrors he had seen behind him. It had become a place of fear and death.
Red, blue, green.
Why? Picking a leaf at random from the piles of reports on his desk, Cortez selected one of the many fateful reports on Tenebrae's heretical activity. Yet another report which he had personally ensured the Inquisition had never received. The Inquisition, Cortez thought resentfully. If he had requested their assistance, and in truth he knew that they represented the only force in the galaxy capable of preventing events of such enormity, then he also knew he would be standing in despair at this very window again. The cure, every bit as lethal as the disease. The irony caused his tear-stained lips to form a rictus grin, and Cortez shook his head. "The only difference lies in the fate of the victims' souls," he shouted aloud, as if addressing a rally of doubtful subjects. "If I called the Inquisition," he shrieked, we would now be watching the grim troops of the Imperium ranging through our beloved thoroughfares, supplying absolution. He had left the military after becoming involved in such cleansing operations, for he had come to call them by another name: murder, genocide. Oh, what's the use in any of it? He sobbed, crushing the hateful reports between his balled fists, ripping and shredding. Cortez systematically began the destruction of all the useless paperwork which had bound him to his desk when he should have been leading his people. His ravings were abruptly interrupted again, this time by an urgent rapping at the door of his office. "Who's there?" Cortez demanded irritably. "Giselle! Captain Giselle, sir." A good man, one of the best, loyal. Sanity tugged at Cortez insistently. He stopped scrabbling at the remaining papers and readjusted his robes. "You may enter." The captain of the Arbites curtly entered the office and stood to attention. He was a tall, solid man, dressed for battle and brandishing a bolter. "Sir, we're evacuating the last of the civilians now, sir. You must leave now, sir, if we are to have any chance of survival, sir." Cortez smiled weakly at the soldier, then indicated the door with a slender, wasted finger. "You go, Jazrael. You have served Tenebrae well. See to it that her people continue to prosper elsewhere," he said in a tired but kindly voice. "Sir?" queried the captain, confusion creasing his uncomprehending face. "I will remain here. It is my duty." The governor forced himself to stand and face the soldier with steely eyes. "Now go, Captain. That is an order," he barked, some fire returning to his voice. With that, Jazrael struck his breastplate in salute, turned curtly on his heel, and was away. The doors swung behind him and shut with a quiet click. Wandering over to his window once more, Cortez felt as if he was in the grip of some strange dream. His attention was once more captured by the ruined streets of Wormwood. 30 floors below, swaggering gangs of chaos-warped Marines strolled among the wreckage. Their booted feet crunched on the shattered stained glass that once illuminated Wormwood's proud buildings. Any pockets of survivors they chanced upon were swept away in a vague wash of bolt gun shells, swatted like gnats. Following in the wake of the traitor Marine cordon, Cortez glimpsed a procession, of all things, approaching the plaza, a victory train of incongruous gaiety and celebration, attended by ragged heretics and capering demons. To the governor, it looked almost medieval. Here, a plague-bearer, foul demonic servant of Nurgle, dipped an infected finger into the wounds of a dying man. There, a heretic carved designs into his own flesh in the vile name of Slanesh. At the centre of the march, an honour guard of traitors from the Word-Bearer Legion of Chaos Space Marines, 4 in all, reverently bore a large, upright metal cylinder, approximately 12 feet in height and 6 in diameter. Cortez's uncomprehending eyes took in its rich decoration. Bas-reliefs of foul, warp-spawned creatures carved from an oily green rock, which filigreed the shining silver surface. Wisps of ephemeral vapour emanated from vents atop the singular device. Perplexed, Cortez watched the procession draw up outside the Adeptus Administratum building, seat of his governorship, and the centre of the civil service on Tenebrae. The traitors came to a halt, and the square began to fill with the adulance of chaos. The word-bearers carried their load up the long, broad steps to the forecourt of the building. Between the majestic pillars of the entryway, now defaced with graffiti and riddled with holes and abrasions from small arms fire, the large casket was set down. Cortez viewed the events unfolding beneath him with mingled intrigue and disquiet. Something was afoot here which he did not understand, a puzzle that called to him enticing. The creed of the God Emperor had always taught unquestioning servitude, and that had sufficed for Cortez, but here, the shadow of his own mortality looming longer and longer, he wanted to at least fathom something of the nature of this forbidden enemy, his destroyer, his doom. He saw the crowd in the square stirring, becoming agitated. The governor knew instinctively that this had something to do with the contents of that dread casket. What is it? Cortez was dimly aware of the dread rising like a bear moth to join his curiosity. Far below, the roiling chaos throng waited impatiently for the coming of the thing Cortez could not see. Vogue, 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 chastise, chastise, chastise. Cortez was at once afraid and awfully fascinated by what could be lurking behind the seals. Vogue, vogue, he mumbled, transfixed by the growing sense of the rhythm. Vacillating, nervous, he was unsure if he even wanted to know the truth at all. Perhaps it was fitting that a plunge into the unknown would draw close the final curtain on his life. He drew a breath. He watched. He felt ready.
Just a Pokemon.
A door cracked open in the graven ceiling, and a billowing carpet of vapor escaped to roll down the steps in heavy, fetid waves. Cortez quickly reached for the field glasses to better view the spectacle. Terminator, he grasped, and his blood ran cold. An armoured figure stepped over the threshold of the cylinder with a heavy, deliberate tread. The governor could see that this creature's eyes were closed, as if in a trance. Stasis slumber, he whispered, hoping for a logical and less than sinister explanation. Then recognition struck him, as if with a physical blow, and he reeled back from the hated window. In a sudden flurry of revelation, Cortez knew what transpired below. Vogue, he whispered. Barely able to form the name, Cortez now remembered where he had heard the name before. This was Lord Vogue, the chastiser of worlds, known as the apostate of Charybdis. Vogue was a notorious creature of chaos from beyond the Eye of Terror. Vogue was a word-bearer priest, a twisted parody of the chaplains of the Imperial Space Marines. He was also rumoured to be a mutant, a being whose voice could loosen the veil betwixt reality and the warp. Bringer of demons, Cortez gasped, horrified that such an entity sought out Tenebrae for its ministrations. With terror came a strange dulling of his senses, and Cortez was surprised to find that now he was more curious than ever, for he knew beyond doubt that Vogue's presence could only signify one thing: the absolute defeat of Tenebrae. The chastiser was here to perform a victory mass for chaos. The governor shuddered involuntarily, watching Vogue as though hypnotised. Slithering over the collar of his Terminator armour came a glistening, slender tentacle. Vogue's head tilted back, and he inhaled sharply. The whites of his eyes showed through slits as the slimy pink limb writhed and whipped with its own unwholesome volition. An aperture on the side of the Terminator's thick neck dilated and oozed a glutinous, clear fluid. The point of the tentacle dug into the hole and began to feed its length into the apostate's neck. The skin on his throat bulged obscenely, its moisture catching glints of the weak light. Vogue came fully awake when the organ was in place, embedded in his larynx. Lord Vogue stepped out into the twilight of Tenebrae. All eyes were upon him, and Cortez joined the chorus of his demented acolytes as a great cheer rose up from the adoring crowd. Vogue scanned his congregation imperiously, his chin held high. Lord Vogue radiated arrogance and pride, and it seemed to Cortez a strange nobility, every bit as impressive as the great Space Marine leaders he had encountered during his distant military service. As Vogue started his address to seal the victory of chaos, the governor marvelled at the way the apostate's voice carried throughout the broad plaza. His words were at once perfectly clear to Cortez, yet somehow buried within a sonic murk which was truly inhuman. The cacophony from the apostate's mouth covered a broad spectrum of sound and was counterpointed by an eerie chanting. This sound, which might have emanated from the very pit of hell itself, redolent with the torment of 1,000,000 damned souls, all came from the lips of a single man. For such was the eulogy of pandemonium, the corrupt chorus of the word-bearers' chaplains. Those gullible fools who daily endure the worship of that rotting monolith, the Emperor, would do well to heed the words of Lorgar. Vogg's voice clucked mockingly at Cortez's heart. We offer our worship to the true gods who govern the affairs of mortals, not a mortal whose affairs are governed by the delusion that he is a deity. The discord of his address and the dreadful import of his words racked the governor's soul with its vile, atonal reverberations. Cortez doubled over, gasping, and attempted to block the unholy sound by clasping white, trembling hands over his ears. Kneeling on the sterile floor of his office, high above the ruin of his world, Dane Cortez convulsed with long, shuddering sobs of denial. It was over, and there would be no atonement for him. The tone of the address had changed, lulled by the droning, white noise of the word-bearer's pontifications. Cortez was drawn, almost hypnotically, back to the window. His attention was drawn and held by the sight of a corpse far below him. It was huddled in a corner of the forecourt where Vogg was giving his speech. Yet another testimony to a tired, frightened old man's failure. The body was that of an Imperial trooper who had fallen trying to defend the Administratum building. Rigel Kramer. The name swept into his memory, but there was no space in Cortez to mourn one friend in the midst of such atrocity. The name seemed inconsequential. As his consciousness swam to the chant, Cortez found that he could find room to marvel at the play of light on the wet lips of Rigel's wounds. Beauty or honour, the old man abruptly cackled, seeing that the warm red defilement of flesh almost looked beautiful when viewed in a certain way. Rigel, Cortez asked, curiously, as if expecting some answer from the corpse below. Rigel, how soon will your carmine beauty give way to the lurid hues of putrefaction? Your attractive red liquid fester into rank, black, necrotic fluids. Cortez's wet eyes glazed over, drained of vitality and volition as bizarre alien thoughts flayed at the layers of his consciousness, sinking keen talons into his essential being. Then what, Rigel? Answer me! I am your lord, damn you! Cortez's fingers scrabbled in futility at the window as the chastiser's voice droned ever on. After decay has taken hold of the sack of meat that was once you, Rigel, what then? He wagged an admonishing finger at the distant body. Let me tell you, young Kramer, let me tell you. Spittle flew unheeded from the snarling lips and smeared the window. Your thrice-damned carcass will generate new life. Oh yes, Rigel, maggots will burst from the eggs laid round your eyes and mouth, and bacteria and mould will break you down into nutrients for the humblest of plants to thrive on. Abruptly, Cortez leapt back from the window and screamed in anguish, terror, and horror. He was appalled at the heretical train his thoughts had taken, realizing that somehow the droning voice of the false priest below had slid into his stream of consciousness, tempting him, and he had succumbed so easily. Tears of shame and loss burned on seamed, leathery cheeks. All for nothing, he shouted, anger beginning to blaze within his core. All this to no end save chaos. Anguished, he was assaulted by a rush of memories. They overwhelmed him, as if eager to escape his corrupted mind. The long, fraught journey through life, the disappointments, and the fresh hopes. But most cruel of all was the opening of his eyes to the excesses of tyranny during military service. He had left the Imperial armies to become a planetary governor and use his newfound understanding to make a better life for people. A better life. All I wanted was a better life, he sobbed, chest heaving with barely controlled misery. And this is how the mighty Imperium repays me. This dead end, this inevitability. Cortez howled aloud. In a frenzy of violence, the old man heaved his desk over, scattering precious artifacts and ornaments to be trampled unheeded. "Oh, Emperor, where are you now? Have you forsaken me?" Regret, disappointment, terror, and misery were gone in a blinding explosion of all-consuming, inarticulate rage at this most subtle of temptations, and at just how badly he had been betrayed by uncaring fate. Bellowing like a maddened beast, Cortez pounded on the window with liver-spotted fists. "Where is my Emperor?" he howled in self-mockery. And what succour could the Emperor offer this poor tormented soul now, he thought bitterly, face reddened in helpless anger. Striding to his neatly ordered shelves, he cleared them in one swoop of his arms. The medals of the various campaigns in which he had served, and the sundry paraphernalia of his office, he hurled across the chamber with an inarticulate howl. "As the traitor claimed, so you are," he shrieked, pointing accusingly towards the skies. A deluded, rotting monolith." The last medals clattered from his fingers with a finality that told him he no longer had any allegiance. "Only myself now." In that moment of deepest betrayal, of deepest loneliness, of deepest despair, Dane Cortez hated with the purity and intensity that could change worlds. "Why have you forsaken me?" he cried challengingly. "Why?" Red, shifting haze started to appear within the room. Cortez stared aghast, yet transfixed, as the fabric of space and time dislocated. Carnal smells assaulted his nostrils as shifting, nebulous figures coalesced within the gathering miasma. "No!" he shrieked, his shrill voice an entreaty to the uncaring gods of both chaos and men. An awful, eerie, mocking laughter ballooned within his skull. His only answer. A warp gate was opening. Too late, Cortez realized what he had done. By the act of resisting the temptation he had been subjected to, the violation of his maddened thoughts had opened the way for the crazed servants of Khorne, the Lord of Blood and War. The one faction missing from the assault on Tenebrae had come in full glory. Crimson light glowed eerily as the gate widened, allowing sleek, red-skinned humanoid figures access to this dimension. Heavily muscled and fearful in aspect, they stepped into the chamber, uncertainly at first, as though unfamiliar with the sound and textures of this realm. Cortez backed away, mouth agape, choked with stark terror. Cruel mouths were filled with rows of carnivorous glistening fangs. Nostrils flared wickedly as they smelt his mortality. Blazing demonic eyes fixed him with a predatory glare. There was to be no escape from that malign intelligence or the bloodlust so driven by it. The bloodletters wielded serrated black swords which were enchanted with the power of death, fit to reap a harvest of souls for their lord. The old man scrabbled at his belt for the las pistol as the snarling fiends shook themselves free of the fading warp gate. Grinning in terrible anticipation, they loped towards the heavy wooden desk, long tongues flickering down to the base of their chins in expectation of the soul kill. Cortez knew without a flicker of doubt that he was about to die. "And for what?" he lamented, gibbering in near mindless terror. Death stalked ever closer, and he was overcome by a sulphurous blast, the infernal reek of Hades. To die for the Imperium, unwieldy and uncaring behemoth which would have soon put him to the sword had he approached them for help. "No!" he cried, and the bloodletters hissed appreciatively. A tang of terror was such a sweet morsel. Then for the foul abominations released by his very own weakness? "No, never that!" Cortez shrieked, backed hard against the far wall of his chamber. As the demons approached, bearing his doom on their wicked blades, a solution began to form in Cortez's anguished mind. Against all odds, the governor found a new strength of resolve within him. He determined it would be neither, not the Imperium nor chaos. The answer was obvious, so obvious that he smiled even as he unlatched his holster flap. So obvious. The demons paused momentarily, confused by the unexpected change of emotion. Fear they knew, terror they relished, confidence they despised. The delay was enough. "For me," he whispered. Before the demons could strike, Dane thrust the muzzle of his ornate las pistol into his mouth and depressed the trigger. Against all the odds, he had escaped. Finally, he was at peace. Thanks very much for watching, everybody. Please remember to give the video a
That
like
was dark.
and subscribe if you're not subscribed. More of these stories and lore and other stuff will be coming very soon. If you'd like to support the channel, please use the links below, like these good chaps here have. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.
Before Shopify, were you wondering, where are my sales at? But now you're selling with Shopify. You're easily selling online, in person, and beyond. Discover how millions...
Blah, 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 blah. Wow.
Let the Galaxy Burn. Narrated by a Border Prince. Unforgiven by Graham McNeil. The midnight dark closed on Brother Sergeant Caitlin of the Dark Angels like a fist. The emission-reduced engines of the rapidly disappearing Thunderhawk were the only points of light he could see. His visor swung into a ghostly green hue, and the outlines of the star-shaped city below became clear as his auto-senses kicked in. The altimeter reading on his visor was unravelling like a lunatic countdown, the shapes below him resolving into clearer, oblong forms. The speed of his descent was difficult to judge. The power armour insulating Kalen from the sensations of icy rushing air and roaring noise as he plummeted downwards. With a pulse of thought, Kalen overlaid the tactical schematics of the city onto his visor, noting with professional pride that the outline of the buildings below almost perfectly matched the image projected before him. The altimeter rune flashed red, and Kalen pulled out of his drop position, smoothly bringing his legs around so that he was falling feet first. Glancing left and right, he saw the same manoeuvre being repeated by his men and slammed the firing mechanism on his chest. He felt the huge deceleration as the powerful rocket motors ignited, slowing his headlong plunge into a controlled descent. Kalen's boots slammed into the marble-flagged plaza, his jump pack flaring a wash of heated air around him as he landed. Streams of bright light licked up from the city, flak waving like undersea fronds as the rebels sought to down the departing Thunderhawk. But the heretic gunners were too late to prevent the gunship from completing its mission. Its deadly cargo had already arrived. Kalen whispered a prayer for the transport's crew and transferred his gaze back to the landing zone. Their drop was perfect. The Thunderhawk's jumpmaster had delivered them dead on target, a target that was thronged with screaming, masked cultists. Kalen ducked a clumsy swing of a cultist power maul and punched his power fist through his enemy's chest. The man shrieking and convulsing as the energized gauntlet smashed through his flesh and bone. He kicked the corpse off his fist and smashed his pistol butt into the throat of another. The man fell, clutching his shattered larynx, and Keelan spared a hurried glance to check the rest of his squad had dropped safely with him. Stuttering blasts of heat and light flared in the darkness as the remaining 9 men of Squad Luptra landed within 5 meters of him, firing their bolters and making short dashes for cover. A cultist ran towards him swinging a giant axe, his features twisted. Kalen shot him in the head. By the lion, these fools just didn't stop coming. He ducked behind a giant marble statue of some nameless cardinal as a heavy burst of gunfire stitched its way towards him from the gigantic cathedral at the end of the plaza. Muzzle flashes came through smashed stained glass windows, the bullets tearing up the marble in jagged splinters and cutting down cultists indiscriminately. Kalen knew that advancing into the teeth of those guns would be bloody work indeed. Another body ducked into cover with him, the dark green of his armour partially obscured by his chaplain's robes. Interrogator Chaplain Barrius raised his bolt pistol. The weapon's barrel was intricately tooled, and its muzzle smoked with recent firing. "Squad, form up on me," ordered Kalen. "Prepare to assault. Evens advance, odds covering fire." The prophet had risen on the cathedral world of Valador, and with him came the planet's doom. Within a year of his first oration, the temple of the divine emperor had been cast down, and his faithful servants, from the highest cardinal to the lowliest scribes, were cast into the charnel fire pits. Millions of purged and choked clouds of human ash fell as grotesque snow for months after. The nearest Imperial Guard regiment, the 43rd Carpathian Rifles, had fought through the temple precinct for nearly 9 months since the planet's succession, battling in vicious close combat with the fanatical servants of the Prophet. The pacification had progressed well, but now ground to a halt before the walls of the planet's capital city, Angelicus. The heavily fortified cathedral city had withstood every assault, but now it was the turn of the Adeptus Astartes to bring the rebellion to an end. For the Space Marines of the Dark Angels chapter, more than just imperial honour and retribution was at stake. Many centuries ago, Valador had provided a clutch of fresh recruits to the chapter, and the planet's heresy was a personal affront to the Dark Angels. Honour must be satisfied. The Prophet must die. Dozens of cultists were pitched back by the Space Marines' first volley, blood bright on their robes. More died as the bolters fired again. Kalen exploded from cover, a laser blast scouring a groove in his shoulder plate. The first cultist to bar his path died without even seeing the blow that killed him. The next saw Killian bearing down on him, and the Marine Sergeant relished the look of terror on his face. His power fist took his head off. Gunfire sounded louder than before as more covering fire raked the robed cultists. Kalen fought and killed his way towards the temple doors, gore spattering his armour bright red. All around him, Squad Luxra killed with a grim efficiency. Short dashes for cover combined with deadly accurate bolter fire had brought them to within 80 metres of the temple doors with no casualties. In their wake, more than 200 cultists lay dead or dying. Powerful blasts of gunfire spat from the smashed windows, too heavy to charge through, even for power armour, Kalian knew. He activated his Voxcom. "Brother Lucius?" "Yes, Brother Sergeant." "You have a good throwing arm on you. You think you can get a couple of grenades through those windows?" Lucius risked a quick glance over the rim of the fountain he was using for cover and nodded curtly. "Yes, Brother Sergeant. I believe I can, the lion willing." "Then do so," ordered Kalen. "The Emperor guide your aim." Kalen shifted position and spoke to the rest of his squad. "Be ready. We move on the grenade's detonation." Each tiny rune on his visor that represented one of his men blinked once as they acknowledged receipt of the order. Kalen glanced around to check that Chaplain Barrius was ready too. The hulking figure of the chaplain was methodically examining the dead cultists, pulling back their robes like a common looter. Caelan's lip curled in distaste before he quickly reprimanded himself for such disloyalty. But what was the chaplain doing? "Brother Chaplain," called Caelan. Barris looked up, his helmeted face betraying nothing of his intent. "We are ready," Caelan finished. "Brother Sergeant," began Barris, moving to squat beside Caelan. "When we find the Prophet, we must not kill him. I wish him taken alive." "Alive? But our orders are to kill him." "Your orders have been changed, Sergeant," hissed the chaplain, his voice like cold flint. "I want him alive. Do you understand?" "Yes, Brother Chaplain. I shall relay your orders." "We must expect heavy resistance within the temple. I will tell you now that I do not expect many, if any, of your men to survive," advised Barris, his voice laden with the promise of death. "Why did you not brief me on this earlier?" snapped Caelan. "If the forces we are to face are so strong, then we should hold here for now and call in support." "No," stated Barrios. "We do this alone or we die in the attempt." His voice broke no disagreement, and Caelan suddenly understood that there was more at stake with this mission than simple assassination. Regardless of the chaplain's true agenda, Caelan was duty-bound to obey. He nodded. "As you wish, Chaplain." He opened the Voxcom to Lucius again. "Now, Brother Lucius." Lucius stood, live as a jungle cat, and powered a frag grenade through each of the windows either side of the cathedral doors. No sooner had the last grenade left his hand than the heavy blast of a las cannon disintegrated his torso. The heat of the laser blast flashed his super-oxygenated blood to a stinking red steam. Twin thumps of detonation and screams. Flashing light and smoke poured from the cathedral windows like black tears. "Now!" yelled Caelan, and the Marines rose from cover and sprinted towards the giant bronze doors. Scattered small arms fire impacted on their armour, but the Space Marines paid it no heed. To get inside was the only imperative. Caelan saw brother Marius falter, a lucky shot blasting a chunk of armour and flesh from his upper thigh, staining the dark green of his armour bright red. Chaplain Barrios grabbed Marius as he staggered and dragged him on. Caelan's powerful legs covered the distance to the temple in seconds, and he flattened his back into the marble of the cathedral wall. Automatically, he snapped off a pair of grenades from his belt and hurled them through the smoking windows. The shockwave of detonation shook the cathedral doors, and he vaulted through the shattered window frame, snapping shots left and right from his bolt pistol. Inside was a blackened hell of smoke, blood, and cooked flesh. Bodies lay sprawled, limbs torn off, skeletons pulverized, and organs melted. The wounded gunners shrieked horribly. Caelan felt no pity for them. They were heretics and had betrayed the Emperor. They deserved a death 100 times worse. The Dark Angels poured inside, moving into defensive positions, clearing the room and dispatching the wounded. The vestibule was secure, but Caelan's instinct told him that it wouldn't remain that way for long. Marius propped himself up against the walls. The bleeding had already stopped, the wound already sealed. He would fight on, Caelan knew. It took more than a shattered pelvis to stop a Dark Angel. "We have to keep moving," he snapped. Movement meant life. Chaplain Barrios nodded, reloading his pistol, and turned to face Caelan's squad. "Brothers," he began, "we are now in the fight of our lives. Within this desiccated temple, you shall see such sights as you have never witnessed in your darkest nightmares. Degradation and heresy now make their home in our beloved Emperor's vastness, and you must shield your souls against it." Barrios lifted his chaplain's symbol of office, the Crozius Arcanum, high. The blood-red gem at its centre sparkled like a miniature ruby sun. "Remember our Primarch, and the Lion shall watch over you." Kalen muttered a brief prayer to the Emperor, and they pressed on. "They are within your sanctuary, my lord," said Castor, worry plain in his every syllable. "What would you have us do to destroy them?" "Nothing more than you are already, Castor." "Are you sure, lord? I do not doubt your wisdom, but they are Adeptus Astartes. They will not give up easily." "I know. I'm counting on it. Do you trust me, Castor?" "Absolutely, lord, without question." "Then trust me now. I shall permit the Angel of Blades to kill all the Marines, but I want their chaplain." "It will be as you say, lord," replied Castor, turning to leave. The prophet nodded and rose from his prayers to his full, towering height. He turned quickly, exposing a sliver of dark green beneath his voluminous robes. "And Castor," he hissed, "I want him alive." Chaplain Barrius swung the Crozius in a brutal arc, crushing bone and brain. Fighting their way along a reliquary stubbed cloister, the Marines battled against more followers of the Prophet. The Dark Angels fought in pairs, each warrior protecting the other's back. Kalen fought alongside Barrius, chopping and firing. The slide on the bolt pistol racked back empty. He slammed the butt of his pistol across his opponent's neck, shattering his spine. Barrius slew his foes with a deadly grace, ducking, kicking and stabbing. The true genius of a warrior was to create a space to flow between the blades where skill and instinct merged in lethal harmony. Enemy weapons sailed past him, and Kalen saw that Barrius was a warrior born. Kalen felt as clumsy as a new recruit next to the exquisite skill of the interrogator chaplain.
Anything else?
Brother Marius fell, a power maul smashing into his injured hip. Hands held him down, and an axe split his skull in two. Yet even though his head had been destroyed, he shot his killer dead. Then it was over. The last heretic fell. His blood split across the tiled floor as Kalen slammed a new magazine into his pistol. Barrius knelt beside the corpse of Brother Marius and intoned the prayer for the fallen. "You will be avenged, brother. Your sacrifice has brought us closer to expunging the darkness of the past. I thank you for it."
Oh, they're
Kalen
after
frowned.
freaking fallen.
What did the chaplain mean by that? Barrius stood and pulled out a data slate, displaying the floor plans of the cathedral. While the chaplain confirmed their location, Kalen surveyed his surroundings in more detail.
Boxes.
The walls were dressed stone, a fine carving hacked off and replaced with crude etchings depicting worlds destroyed, angels on fire, and a recurring motif of a broken sword and a dying lion. The rendering was crude, but the origins of the imagery was unmistakable. "What is this place?" he asked aloud. "This is our chapter's history. On these walls, Lionel Johnson, dead Caliban. The heretics daubed their halls with mockeries of our past." He turned to Barrius. "Why?" Barrius looked up from the data slate. Before he could answer, roaring gunfire hammered through the cloisters. Brother Cyan and Brother Gaius fell, heavy caliber shells tearing through their breastplates and exploding within their chest cavities. Brother Septimus staggered, most of his shoulder torn away by a glancing hit, his arm hanging by gory threads of bone and sinew. He fired back with his good arm until another shot took his head off. Kalen snapped off a flurry of shots, diving into the cover of a fluted pillar. The concealed guns were pinning them in position, and it would only be a matter of time until more cultists were sent against them. As if in answer to his thoughts, a stubbed timber door at the end of the cloister burst open, and a mob of screaming warriors charged towards them. Kaelin's jaw hung open in disgust at the sight of the enemy. They were clad in dark green mockeries of power armour, an abominable mirror of the Space Marines' glory. Crude copies of the Dark Angel chapter symbol, spread wings with a dagger through the centre, adorned their shoulder plates, and Kaelin felt a terrible rage build in him at this heresy. The Marines of Squad Lutra screamed their battle cry and surged forward to tear these blasphemers apart and punish them for such effrontery. To mock the Dark Angels was to invite savage and terrible retribution. Fueled by righteous anger, Squad Lutra fought with savage skill. Blood, death, and screams filled the air. As the foes met in the centre of the cloister, the hidden guns opened fire again. A storm of bullets and ricochets, cracked armour and smoke engulfed the combatants, striking Space Marines and their foes indiscriminately. A shell tore downwards through the side of Kaelin's helmet. Redness, pain, and metallic stink filled his senses, driving him to his knees. He gasped and hit the release catch of his ruined helmet, wrenching it clear. The bullet had torn a bloody furrow in the side of his head and blasted the back of his helmet clear, but he was alive. The Emperor and the Lion had spared him. A booted foot thundered into the side of his head. He rolled, lashing out with his power fist, and a cultist fell screaming, his leg destroyed below the knee. He pushed himself to his feet and lashed out again, blood splashing his face as another foe died. Kaelin sprinted for the cover of the cloister, realising they had been lured out of cover by the fraudulent Dark Angels. He cursed his lack of detachment, angrily wiping sticky redness from his eyes. The tactical situation was clear. They could not go back the way they had come. To reach the main vestibule was not an option. The gunfire would shred them before they got halfway. The only option was onwards, and Kaelin had a gnawing suspicion that their enemies knew this and were channeling them towards something even more fearsome. Barrios shouted his name over the stuttering blasts of shooting, indicating the timber door the armoured cultists had emerged from. "I believe we have only one way out of this. Forward, Sergeant." Kaelin nodded, his face grim as the icon representing Brother Christos winked out. Another Space Marine dead for this mission. But Kaelin knew that they would all lay down their lives for the mission, no matter what it was. Chaplain Barrios had decided that it was worth all of them dying to achieve it, and that was good enough for him. Under cover of the cloisters, Barrios and the remaining 5 members of Squad Lutra sprinted through the stubbed door that led out of this fire trap. Sergeant Kaelin just hoped that they weren't running into something worse. "Is the angel ready to administer the evisceral blessing, Castor?" inquired the prophet. "It is, my lord," said Castor, his voice trembling with fear. The prophet smiled, understanding the cause of his underling's unease. "The angel of blades makes you uncomfortable, Castor." Castor fidgeted nervously, his bald head beaded with sweat. "It frightens me, my lord. I fear that we count such a thing as our ally. It slaughtered 10 of my acolytes as we released it from the crypts. It was horrible." "Horrible, Castor?" soothed the prophet, placing both hands on the priest's shoulders, his gauntlets large enough to crush Castor's head. "Was it any more horrible than what we did to take this world? Was it bloodier than the things we did when we stormed this temple? There is already blood on your hands, Castor. What matters a little more? Is what we do here not worthy of some spilled blood?" "I know, but to actually see it, to taste and smell it, it was terrible." The priest was shaking. The memory of the angel had unmanned him completely. "I know, Castor, I know," acknowledged the prophet, "but all great things must first wear terrible masks in order that they may inscribe themselves on the mind of the common man." The prophet shook his head sadly. "It is the way of things." Castor nodded slowly. "Yes, my lord, I understand." The prophet said, we bring a new age of reason to this galaxy. The fire we begin here will ignite 1,000 others that will engulf the false emperor's realm in the flames of revolution. We shall be remembered as heroes, Caster. Do not forget that. Your name shall shine amongst men as the brightest star in the firmament. Caster smiled, his vanity and ego overcoming his momentary squeamishness. Fresh determination shone in his zealous eyes. The prophet turned away. It was almost too easy. Sergeant Keelan stalked the darkened corridors of the cathedral like a feral predator, eyes constantly on the move, hunting his prey. Flickering electro-flambeau cast a dim glow that threw the carved walls into stark relief, and he deliberately averted his gaze from them. Looking too carefully at the images carved into the walls left his eyes stinging, and a nauseous rolling sensation in the pit of his stomach. Since leaving the death trap of the cloister, they had snaked deeper into the cathedral, and Kaelin couldn't help but feel that they were in terrible danger. Not the danger of dying. Kaelin had stared death in the face too many times to fear extinction, but the danger of temptation and blasphemy. That was another matter entirely. The paths to damnation were many and varied, and Kaelin knew that evil did not always wear the horns and breathe fire, for if it did, all men would surely turn from it in disgust. No, evil came subtly in the night, as pride, as lust, as envy. In his youth, Kaelin had known such feelings, had fought against them, all the whispered seductions that flesh and the dark could offer in the dead of night, but he had prayed and fasted, secure in his faith in the divine emperor of mankind. He had achieved a balance in his soul, a tempering of the beast within him. He understood that there were those who gave in to their base desires and turned their faces from the emperor's light. For them, there could be no mercy. They were deviants of the worst kind. They were an infection, spreading their lies and abomination to others, whose weakened faith was an open doorway to them. If such forces were at work within these walls, then Kaelin would fight till the last drop of blood had been squeezed from his body to root it out and destroy it. Barris led the way, his strides long and sure. The passageway they followed dipped slightly, and Kaelin could feel a cool breath of night air caress his skin. The stone walls gave way to a smooth blackened glass, opaque and blemish-free, widening to nearly 10 metres across. The walls curved up into the rounded arch above them and were totally non-reflective. Doors constructed of the same material barred the way forward, the susurration of air coming from where the glass had been cracked near the top of the frame. An ominous stain dripped down the inside face of the door from where a torn fragment of white cloth was caught, flapping in the breeze on a jagged shard of broken glass. "Blood," said Barris. Kaelin nodded. He had smelt it before seeing it. An odd, whickering mechanical sound came from the other side of the doors, and Kaelin felt an instinctive dread send a hot jolt of fear into his system. Barris stepped forwards and thundered his boot into the door, smashing it completely from the frame. Black glass flew outwards, and Kaelin swept through the portal, bolter and power fist at the ready. Kaelin entered a domed arena, its stone floor awash with blood and sliced chunks of flesh. The stink of the charnel house filled the air. The same non-reflective black substance that had formed the door enclosed the arena. He pounded down some steps and skidded to a halt, his blood thundering in horror at the sight before him. A mad screaming echoed around the enclosed arena. A dome of utter darkness rose above them as the horrifying bulk of the creature before the Space Marines turned to face them with giant, slashing strides. Perhaps it had once been a dreadnought. Perhaps it had evolved or mutated in some vile parody of a dreadnought. but whatever it was clearly a beast of pure evil. Even Barris, who had fought monstrous abominations before, was shocked at the terrifying appearance of a biomechanical killing machine. Fully 6 meters high, the creature stood on 4 sprayed, spider-like legs of scything blades that cut the air with a deadly grace. A massive, mechanically muscled torso rose from the centre of the bladed legs, and clawed arms, lightning-sheathed, swung insanely from its shoulders, upon which was mounted an ornately carved heavy bolter. At its back, a pair of glittering bladed wings flapped noisily, their lethal edges promising death to any who came near. The biomachine's head was a pulped mass of horribly disfigured flesh. Multiple eyes, milky and distended, protruded from enlarged and warped sockets. Its vicious gash of slobbering mouth was filled with hundreds of serrated, chisel-like teeth, and its skin was a grotesque, oily texture, the colour of rotten meat. It was impossible to tell where the man ended and the machine began. Its entire body was soaked in blood, gobbets of torn flesh still hanging from its claws and teeth. But the final horror, the most sickening thing of all, was that where the metal of the sarcophagus hide was still visible, it was coloured an all too familiar shade of dark green, and upon its shoulder was the symbol of the Dark Angels. Whatever this creature was, it had once been a brother space marine. Now, it was the Angel of Blades, and as the Space Marines recoiled in horror, the monster howled in mad triumph and stamped forwards on its scythe legs. The speed of the Angel of Blades was astonishing for such a huge creature. Blood burst from its face as the Space Marines overcame their shock and began firing their bolters. Every shell found its mark, detonating wetly within the Angel's dead skin mask, but its lunatic screams continued unabated. A silver blur lashed from the monster. A casual flick of its bladed leg licked out and eviscerated Brother Malleus quicker than the eye could follow. His shorn halves collapsed in a flood of red, but his bellows of pain were drowned by the Angel's hateful shrieks. The Baroque heavy bolter, mounted on the beast's shoulder, roared and blasted the remains of Malleus apart. Kalen knew it had to die. Now. He sprinted across the courtyard as the rest of the squad spread out and leapt in front of the rampaging machine. A brilliant burst of blue-white lightning arcing from his power fist as he struck at the beast's face. A coruscating corona of burning fire enveloped its huge frame as the lethal power of Kalen's gauntlet smashed home. Its deformed flesh blistered and sloughed from its face, exposing a twisted metallic bone structure beneath. The Angel struck back, unheeding of the terrible hurt done to it. Kalen dodged a swipe meant to remove his head and rolled beneath its flailing arms. He powered his cracking fist into its groin and ripped upwards. The power fist scored deep grooves in the Angel's exterior, but Kalen's strike failed to penetrate its armoured shell. The beast sidestepped, and another leg slashed out at him. He ducked back, not quick enough, and his armoured knee joint thundered into his chest, hurling him backwards. Kalen's breastplate cracked wide open, crushing his ribs and shattering the Imperial Eagle on his chest into a million fragments. Bright lights exploded before his eyes as he fought for breath and struggled to rise, reeling from the massive impact. Even as he fell, he knew he had been lucky. Had the cutting edge struck him, he would now be as dead as Malleus. Heavy bolter shells spat from the shoulder-mounted gun, hammering into his legs and belly, driving him to his knees. One shell managed to penetrate the cracks in his armour, and he screamed, white-hot fire bathing his nerves as the shell blasted a fist-sized hole in his hip, blood washing in a river down his thigh. He fell to the ground as the Angel loomed above him. Its bloody claws poised to deliver the death blow and tear Kalen in two. With a howling battle cry, Chaplain Barrius and the surviving members of Squad Lutra rushed to attack the monstrosity from the flanks and rear. Brother Janus died instantly, decapitated by a huge sweep of the creature's claws. Another leg whipped out, impaling his corpse and lifting him high into the air. Brother Tamian leapt upon the thing from behind, holding his sword in a reverse grip and driving it into the angel's back with a yell of triumph. The monster screamed and bucked madly, casting the brave Space Marine from its back. Its wings glittered in the torchlight and powered wide with a ringing clash of metal. The discordant shriek of steel on steel sounded as the angel's wings slashed the air, and a storm of razor-edged feathers flew from the beast's back and engulfed Tamian as he raised his bolter. He had no time to scream as the whirlwind of blades slashed him through and tore his body to shreds. The bloody chunks of flesh and armour that fell to the ground were no longer recognisable as human. Barrius smashed his Crozius Arcanum across the back of one of the angel's knee joints, ducking a swipe of the beast's razor wings. Brother Orient and Brother Persis hammered the huge machine from the front, while Kalen pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. Orient died as the angel caught him with both sets of claws, ripping his body apart and tossing the pieces aside in contempt. The beast staggered as Barrius finally chopped through the silver steel of its leg. It tried to turn and slash at its diminutive assailant, but staggered as the severed joint collapsed under its weight. The huge arm spun as it fought for balance. Kalen and Barrius were quick to press home their advantage. Kalen smashed his power fist into the monstrosity's mutated face, the huge gauntlet obliterating its features and tearing through its armoured sarcophagus. Kalen kept pushing deeper and deeper inside the heart of the monster's body. The stench gusting from the rotted interior was the odour of weak old corpse. His fist closed around something greasy and horribly organic, and the angel shuddered in agony. Lifting Kalen from the ground, he grasped onto the beast's shell with his free hand, still struggling to tear the beast's heart out. Agony coursed through his body as the angel's limbs spasmed on his wounded hip and chest. Kalen's grip slid inside the angel's body, glistening amniotic fluid pouring over his arm and preventing him from slaying the vile creature that lurked within its body. His grip finally found purchase. A writhing, pulsing thing with a grotesque, peristaltic motion. He closed his fist on the fleshy substance of the monstrosity's heart and screamed as he released a burst of power within the biomachine's shell. The monster convulsed as the deadly energies of the power fist whiplashed inside its shell, blue fire geysering from its exhausts. Its legs wobbled and the massive beast collapsed, sliding slowly to its knees.
Yeah,
a stinking black gore gushed from every joint, and its demonic wailing dimmed and at last fell silent. Kalen wrenched clear his gauntlet, a grimace of pain and revulsion contorting his features as the lifeless angel of blades toppled forwards, a mangled heap of fetid meat and metal. Kalen slid down the angel's shell and collapsed next to the foul creature, bloodloss, shock and pain robbing him of his prodigious strength. Breathless, Chaplain Barris gripped Kalen's arm and helped him to his feet. Brother Persis joined them, his dark green armour stained black with the monster's death fluids. The three dark angels stood by the rotted corpse and tried to imagine how such a thing could possibly exist. Kalen limped towards the remains of the beast and stared at the shattered carapace of the angel's shell. The iconography on the sarcophagus was of a winged figure in a green robe, carrying a scythe. Its face shrouded in the darkness of its hood. Fluted scrollwork below the image on its chest bore a single word, partially obscured by black, oily blood. Kalen reached down, wiping his hand across the carapace, and felt as though his heart had been plucked from his chest. He sank to his knees as he stared at the word, willing it not to be true, but it remained the same, etched with an awful finality. Caliban. The Dark Angels' lost homeworld, destroyed in the Great Heresy thousands of years ago. How this thing could have come from such a holy place, Kalen did not know. He rose and turned to Barrius. You knew about this, didn't you? He asked. The chaplain shook his head. About this abomination? No. That we could face one of our brothers turned to the dark powers, yes, I did. Kaelin's face twisted in a fixture of anger and disbelief. The dark powers. How can that be possible? It cannot be true. A voice from the shadows, silky and seductive, said, I'm afraid that it is, Sergeant. Kaelin, Barris, and Paris spun to see a tall, hugely built figure in flowing white robes emerge from the shadows, accompanied by a stoop-shouldered man with a shaven head. The tall figure wore his black hair short, close cropped into his skull, and 3 gold studs glittered on his forehead. His handsome features were smiling wryly. Barrios swiftly drew his bolt pistol and fired off the entire clip at the robed figure. As each shot struck, a burst of light flared around the man, but he remained unharmed. Kaelin could see the faint outline of a rosarius beneath his robes. The small amulet would protect the prophet from their weapons, and Kaelin knew that such protection would be almost impossible to defeat. All around the arena, the opaque glass walls began to sink into the ground, and a score of armed men stepped through, their weapons aimed at the 3 Space Marines. Barris dropped the empty bolt pistol, and reluctantly, Kaelin and Persis did likewise.
Yay.
How could it be true? Asked Kaelin again. And who are you? It's very simple, Sergeant. My name is Kephesus, and once I was a Dark Angel like you. When your dead husk of an emperor still walks amongst you, we were betrayed by Lionel Johnson. He abandoned our chapter's true master, Luther, and left with the Emperor to conquer the galaxy. The Primarch left him to rot on a backwater planet while he vaingloriously took the honour of battle that should have been ours. How could he have expected us not to fight him on his return? Barris stepped forward and removed his helm, tossing it aside as he stared at the tall figure with undisguised hatred. He raised his Crozius Arcanium to point at the other's chest. I know you, Kepheus. I have read of you, and I will add your name to the Book of Salvation. It was necessary for Luther to remain behind on Caliban. His was a position of great responsibility. Necessity, Chaplain, is the plea for every act of ignorance your Imperium perpetrates. It is the argument of tyrants and the plea of slaves, snapped the prophet. Wipe the virtue from your eyes. We were cast aside, scattered throughout time and space to become the fallen. And for that, I will kill you. He nodded towards the dead monstrosity, his earlier composure reasserting itself, and said, You killed the Angel of Blades. I am impressed. The prophet smiled and parted his robes, allowing them to fall at his feet. Beneath them, he wore a suit of powered armour, ancient and painted unmistakably in the colours and icons of the Dark Angels. The ornate form of a Rosarius, similar to the one worn by Barrios, hung on a chain, nestling against the eagle on his breastplate. I am Kepheus, but that name no longer has any meaning for me. I forswore it the day Lionel Johnson betrayed us. The Primarch saved us, roared Barrios, his face contorted in fury. You dare to blaspheme against his blessed name? Kephesus shook his head slowly. You are deluded, Chaplain. I think that it is time you start looking at yourself and judge the lie you live. You can project it back at me, but I am only what lives inside each and every one of you. I am a reflection of you all. Sneering, he descended the steps to stand before the interrogator Chaplain, pulling a finger chain from a pouch around his waist. Attached along its length were several polished blades, each inlaid with a fine tracery of gold wire. Barrios' eyes widened in shock, and he reached for his hip scabbard, drawing an identical blade. You call these weapons blades of reason? Such an irony. It is as much a badge of office to you as your Crozarius, is it not? I have 11 here, each taken from the corpse of a Dark Angel chaplain. I will take yours and make it an even dozen. Without warning, he snapped a blade from the chain and spun on his heel, slashing it across Percy's throat. The Space Marine sank to the ground, arterial blood bathing his breastplate crimson. Kalen screamed and launched himself forward, swinging his powered fist at the Prophet's head. Kephisus swayed aside and smashed his bladed fist into Kalen's ribs. The neural wires inscribed in the blades shrieked fiery electric agony along Keelan's nerves, and he howled as raw pain flooded every fibre in his body. His vision swam, and he fell to the ground screaming, the blades still lodged in his side. Barrius howled in fury and slashed with his Crozius Arcanum. Kephisus ducked and lunged in close, tearing the Rosarius from around Barrius's neck. Silver and gold flashed. Blood spurted. The chaplain fell to his knees, mouth open in mute horror as he felt his lifeblood pump from his ruined throat. He fell beside Keelan and dropped his weapon beside the fallen sergeant. Kephisus reached down and knelt beside the dying chaplain. He smiled indulgently and scooped up Barris's intricate blade, threading the thin chain through its hilt. An even dozen. Thank you, chaplain, hissed Kephisus. Sergeant Keelan gritted his teeth and fought to open his eyes. The Prophet's blades were lodged deep in his flesh. With a supreme effort of will, each tiny movement bringing a fresh spasm of agony, he reached down and dragged the weapon from his body. His vision cleared in time for him to see the Prophet leaning over Chaplain Barrius. He growled in anger and with strength born of desperation lunged forward, throwing himself at the heretic. Both hands outstretched, he slashed with the blades and tried to crush the Prophet's head with his power fist. But Kephisus was too quick and dodged back, but not before Kalen's hand closed about an ornate chain around his neck. He tore it free. He rolled forwards, falling at the Prophet's feet, and gasped in pain. Kephisus laughed and addressed the men around the arena. You see, the might of the Adeptus Astartes lies broken at my feet. What can we not achieve when we can humble their might with such ease? Kalen could feel the pain ebbing from his body and glanced down to see what lay in his hand and smiled viciously. He lifted his gaze to look up into the shining, mad face of the Prophet and with a roar of primal hatred struck out at the traitor Dark Angel, his power fist crackling with lethal energy. He felt as though time slowed. He could see everything in exquisite detail. Every face in the arena was trained on him, every gun, but none of that mattered now. All he could focus on was killing his foe. His vision tunneled until all he could see was Kephisus' face, smugly contemptuous. His power fist connected squarely on the Prophet's chest, and Kalen felt a fleeting instant of pure pleasure when he saw the heretic's expression suddenly change as he saw what the sergeant held aloft in his other hand. Kephisus' chest disintegrated, his armour split wide open by the force of the powerful blow. Kalen's power fist exploded from his back, shards of bone and blood spraying the arena's floor. Kalen lifted the impaled Prophet high and shouted to the assembled cultists, "Such is the fate of those who would defy the will of the immortal Emperor." He hurled the body of Kephisus, no more than blood-soaked rags, to the ground and howled in painful triumph. Kalen was a terrifying figure, drenched in blood and howling with battle lust. As he stood in the centre of the arena, the black glass walls rapidly began to rise and the armed men vanished from sight, their fragile courage broken by the death of their leader. Kalen slumped to the ground and opened his other fist, letting the Rosarius he had inadvertently torn from around the Prophet's neck fall to the ground. A hand brushed his shoulder and he turned to see the gasping face of Chaplain Barrius. The man struggled to speak but could only wheeze breathlessly. His hand scrabbled around his body, searching. Guessing Barrius' intention, Caelan picked up the fallen Crozius Arcanum and placed it gently in the chaplain's hand. Barrius coughed a mouthful of blood and shook his head. He opened Caelan's fist, pressed the Crozius into the sergeant's hand, and pointed towards the corpse of the fallen Dark Angel. "Deathwing," hissed Barrius with his last breath, and closed his eyes as death claimed him. Caelan understood. The burden of responsibility had been passed to him now. He held the symbol of office for a Dark Angel's chaplain, and though he knew that there was much for him yet to learn, he had taken the first step along a dark path. News of the prophet's death spread rapidly throughout Angelicus, and within the hour, the rebel forces broadcast their unconditional surrender. Caelan slowly retraced his steps through the cathedral precinct, using the Voxcom to call in the gunship that had delivered their assault. He limped into the main square, squinting against the bright light of the breaking morning. The Thunderhawk sat in the centre of the plaza, engines whining, and the forward ramp lowered. As he approached the gunship, a lone Terminator in bone-white armour descended the ramp to meet him. Caelan stopped before the Terminator and offered him the Crozarius and a thin chain of 12 blades. Caelan said, "The name of Kephesus can now be added to the Book of Salvation." The Terminator took the preferred items and said, "Who are you?" Caelan considered the question for a moment before replying. "I am Deathwing," he answered. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you enjoyed this, please do consider subscribing to the channel and give this video a like and share if you think anyone you know might be interested in it. More videos are coming up, so please make sure you hit that bell so you get notified. And if you would like to support the channel, please consider using the links below. And for those of you who do, you can see your names here. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. It really helps with this work that I do here on the channel. And yeah, I'm going to be doing more soon. So yeah, stay tuned. Cheers.
The $5 meal deal at McDonald's means you get to pick between a McDouble or a McChicken.
Let the Galaxy Burn. Narrated by a Border Prince. Children of the Emperor by Barrington J. Bailey. Hoarse screams and the screech of tortured hot metal filled the air. Massive laser blasts were punching into the spaceship. They superheated the air that men breathed, set fire to everything that could burn, and sent fireballs exploding through the crowded passageways. Imperial Guardsman Floscan Hartoum found himself in a crowd of jostling, panicking men. Minutes before, the men of the Aurelian 15th Regiment had been ordered to the armoury to collect their lasguns and short swords in case the enemy should manage to teleport aboard. They would never reach the armoury now. The crippled troopship, Emperor's Vengeance, was in a state of absolute chaos. Suddenly, a great howl of collective terror rose up. Down the corridor, a glowing, writhing red mass had appeared, rolling down the passageway towards them. Like the others, Floscan turned and ran. He had been at the back of the crowd. Now he was at the front. Pushed from behind, he fell, then managed to get his legs under him and leapt. Behind him, he heard an automatic emergency bulkhead descend with a thump. Staggering to his feet, he found that he was alone in an empty section of corridor. He had been the only one to slither under the bulkhead as he came down. Everyone else was trapped on the other side. Floscan stood, shaking, hearing the fireball slam against the steel partition, accompanied by the agonized shrieks of his comrades who were being incinerated. He pressed his hands to his ears to shut out the cries. The Emperor's Vengeance was old, centuries old, Guardsman Hartoum firmly believed that only the holy rituals carried out daily by the ship's priests kept it in one piece. But it was meticulously tended. The burnished metal ribs of the arch-roofed passageway gleamed. Effigies and efficacious runes, etched at various times by mechanics and priests, adorned the walls. But right now, Floskin was blind to all this. The dying screams of his comrades fading behind him. He stumbled to an oval porthole set in a brass surround and stared blindly out. He was looking into the star-strewn blackness of space. Unknown miles away, the sharp outlines of the attacking ships were visible. Even at this distance, they were an extraordinary sight. A motley collection had set of mongrelized and ramshackle craft, looking for all the galaxy as though they had each been constructed from 2 or 3 spacecraft, crudely welded together. They had set upon the flotilla of troop transports, clumsy barges only lightly armed, as it emerged from the warp to take its bearings. The result was utter carnage. The makeshift character of the ships identified their crews as orcs, who did not build spacecraft themselves, but used whatever they could capture or scavenge from other races. How they must have roared with savage delight to see units of the Imperial Navy materialise unsuspectingly before them. Now the flotilla's escorting battlecruiser, Glorious Redeemer, hove into view. A massive structure with Baroque, gargoyle-encrusted spires and weapons turrets, which were gouting plasma as it attempted to defend the troop ships. But it was heavily outgunned and had been taken by surprise. Half a dozen orc ships had surrounded it, and their armament was tearing it to pieces, great crenellated chunks spinning off into space. From another of the orc craft, something came flimmering. It was followed by a juddering shock that went right through the vitals of the Emperor's vengeance with a roaring noise. The passageway buckled. Good. From all around came the cacophony of a ship breaking up. They had been hit by a plasma torpedo. Abandon ship! Abandon ship! The order crackled through the antique ceiling speakers. Guardsman Hartoum, however, needed no prompting. He was already dashing for the nearest escape pods, scrambling over the newly made folds and rents in the floor. Belay that order, Guardsman. Fight to the end against the vile enemies of the Emperor. Floskin pulled up sharp. An intimidating figure in a black, square-shouldered longcoat was standing stiffly at the corridor's next bend. It was the Commissar, Lamin Kanan. The grim expression beneath his peaked cap was nothing new. He wore it all the time, but especially during the fanatical morale-boosting lectures Floskin had been required to attend. The order to abandon ship had come from the captain. Floskin had no idea who ranked higher in this situation, captain or commissar, but he did know that if he obeyed the latter, he was unlikely to still be alive 1 minute from now. Instinctively, he moved to the nearby pod. You will not run in the face of the enemy, Guardsman. Where is your lasgun? The last words were drowned out by an enormous squealing of metal being torn apart, followed by the terrifying hiss of air escaping from the ruptured hull. A lasgun suddenly appeared in Commissar Lamin Kanan's hand. Its lethal beam zipped past Hartoum's ear as he hurled himself into the life pod. In the same motion, striking the rune-encrusted button that closed the hermetic seal. His hand trembled with panic. He pulled the lever to eject. Fragments rattled against the pod as it rocketed away from the disintegrating troopship. The fierce acceleration drained the blood from Floskin's brain, and he blacked out. When he came to, the total silence of the pod's close confines, in which there was barely room to move, was frightening. Even the sound of Floskin's breathing seemed unnaturally loud. He dragged himself to the tiny porthole and peered out. If there was anything to be seen at all, it consisted of spread wreckage which occasionally drifted between himself and the stars, making them twinkle. The flotilla was destroyed, and with it the Aurelian 15th Regiment. Of the Orc ships, there was no sign. Guardsman Hartoum fell back on the pod's couch, unable to bear the devastating sight. Aurelia, where Floskin had been raised, was an agricultural world. He had joined the founding Imperial Guard Regiment voluntarily, hoping for challenge and adventure. Now that he had found them, he was wishing for his quiet life back on the farm. He firmly believed in the Emperor, of course, but now he was beyond even his help. He was alone and lost. Rescue was impossible. The Navy would not even know where the flotilla had emerged from the warp. The pod would keep him alive for a few days. And then it would have been better to have died alongside his comrades. Overcome with despair and even shame at his escape, Floskin buried his face in his hands and sobbed for a while. Then he took a grip on himself. He was an Imperial Guardsman, he told himself. The Emperor would expect him to keep up his courage, no matter how bad things became. He steeled himself to face death calmly. Eventually, some dread curiosity drew him back to the porthole. He felt compelled to look again into the void, which was to be his grave. When he did, he gasped, his jaw hanging. There was a planet below him. Floskin Hartoum's heart was beating wildly, thoughts racing through his brain. The planet might have a poisonous atmosphere, it might hold deadly horrors, or it might offer a chance of survival. Though he would be marooned for life. It was beautiful too, with dazzling blue oceans and shining white clouds. The pod could already be falling towards the planet, or it could be in orbit around it, but most likely it was on a course that would take it out of range and unable to reach the shining world. Hartoum would have to act quickly. He studied the simple controls. Escape pods were manufactured cheaply in huge numbers and were best described as crude. Floskin's training in their use had lasted less than 20 minutes, and he barely knew what to do. Luckily, there was little to understand. There were none of the glowing icons and shining runes that would have embellished more sophisticated equipment. Instead, there was included, in the moulding of the control panel, a simple prayer to the Emperor. Fortins terribilitas, adjuva me in extremis. Mighty terribilitas, aid me in my plight. Fervently muttering the prayer, he took hold of the control levers. The gyro whined, rotating the pod to point its snub nose at the luminous world. The small rocket engine fired again, drawing on the scant amount of fuel. Floskin was sent hurtling into the planet's atmosphere. Despite it being his only way to see outside, Floskin dug down the porthole's cover once the buffeting began. He wasn't sure the glassite would be able to withstand the heat that would be generated by the friction of the atmosphere. The rocket engine had soon ran out of fuel and was silent. Escape pods were supposedly to be able to land on a planet automatically, but like everything else about them, the arrangements were rudimentary at best. Escape for defeated guardsmen was scarcely high on the Imperium's list of priorities, and Floskin began to feel there was something wrong. Strapped into the acceleration couch, he was being spun around wildly, tossed up and down, and jerked from side to side. It was getting very hot too, making him wish he had cut off the rocket engine sooner. He had hit the atmosphere at too high a speed. The pod's outer layer was supposed to absorb heat and then shed it by peeling away in fragments, but how thick was it? When it was all gone, he would be roasted alive. So violent became the descent that Floskin passed out again. When he next opened his eyes, he did not know how much later, everything had become still. A breeze was on his face. He could hear a distant chirruping sound, as of unknown animal calls. He had landed. The acceleration couch had been torn from its moorings and his face had struck the control panel. He threw off the restraint straps and felt his aching cheek. It was bleeding. Automatically, he consulted the survival meter under the mangled panel. It told him the planet had a breathable atmosphere, but then he already knew that, because he was already breathing the local air. Evidently, the pod had cracked open on impact. He could see daylight through the gaping rent. His limbs seemed to be made of lead, and he was finding it difficult to move. making him
see.
fearful of having internal injuries. Several times, he struck the rune-inscribed button that should have opened the hatch, but it was stuck. Then he tried to undo the hatch manually. The frame was warped and he was unable to shift it. Finally, panting with effort, he attacked the rent in the pod's side, placing his feet on one edge and bracing his back against the stanchion. The surprisingly thin shell of the pod moved, making a gap large enough for him to squeeze through. He tried to stand up, but found that he couldn't. He had no internal injuries. It was simply that his body weighed 3 or 4 times more than it normally would. He was on a heavy gravity planet. How could he survive if he couldn't even stand up? Guardsman Hartoum struggled to come to his feet. Using his arms, he managed to push himself to a squatting position. Then he heaved with all the strength he could muster in his legs until he thought the blood vessels would burst. God, Emperor, aid me. Grimacing with effort, Floskin came upright, shaking, feeling the gravity drain him of muscle power and tried to drag him down. How long could he maintain himself like this? He looked around him. The sky was shining, metallic blue-grey, casting the landscape in a sinister glow. The terrain consisted of rocky crags and low hills, to which clung shrub-like trees and crimson reeds. Although it was a dismal, depressing environment, over which there seemed to hang a feeling of menace. The escape pod had cracked open on striking a rocky outcropping. Thick white parachute cords straggled from it, but the parachute itself had been torn off sometime during the descent, though presumably not far from the surface, or the impact would have killed him. A stiff, cold wind was blowing, making Floskin shiver. Grey clouds raced overhead.
I can get 2 checkout.
He felt
counters.
dizzy, whether from the blow to his head or because the heavy gravity made it difficult for blood to reach his brain. He did not know. And he felt frightened, filled with foreboding. It was hard to believe that only yesterday he had been cursing the monotony of the space journey to an equally unexciting posting. He was about to sit down again and rest when a hoarse shout made him turn around. He was standing at one end of a shallow valley. Charging along it towards him was a troop of about 20 men. They were massively muscled, evidently well adapted to the heavy gravity, with shaggy hair which streamed behind them in the wind. Some brandished spears, others raised bows, and were whipping arrows from quivers strapped to their backs. And they were heading straight towards him. Death now seemed both certain and sudden, and all of Guardsman Floskin Horton's gloom and uncertainty cleared from his mind. He was defenceless. Escape pods carried no lasguns, which were too expensive to waste on men with little or no chance of survival. He doubted if he could run at all, let alone outdistance his pursuers, and if he took refuge in the pod, he would only be left trapped like an animal. He took a deep breath. Best take it like a soldier of the Aurelian 15th. He would go down fighting with his bare hands. But perhaps there was better than that. A flung spear clattered on the rock to his left. He managed to take a few steps, squatted down and lifted the thick wooden shaft off the ground. It was incredibly heavy in his hands, but somehow he heaved himself erect once more and turned to face the enemy, the spear point held before him. If he could take just one of the attackers with him, he would have died with honour. Another spear came hurtling by, together with a flock of arrows, but the aim was poor and all missed him by a wide berth. There seemed to be something strange about the oncoming natives' gait. As they came close enough for him to make them out clearly, he saw that he had been mistaken about them. They were not men at all. They were 4-footed aliens. Seen from the front, they looked human enough, clad as they were in short smocks of coarse cloth belted at the waist. But from the side or the rear, it was a different matter entirely. Their lower back and rump were sloped and extended, and were supported by a second pair of legs. These were just like the front legs, except that they were shorter, almost stubby. Both pairs seemed to work in unison, so that the creature ran with a swift but swaying gait. The strange spectacle startled Floskin. The introductory address at his regiment's founding flashed through his mind. "You will be fighting aliens, mutants, monsters, heretics, all things abominable to the Emperor. Now, he was to die in fulfillment of those words. But instead of rushing straight at him, the troop thundered past. It was charging not at Flosken, but at something else. Flosken turned to look and dropped his spear, paralysed with shock. The quadruped aliens had been shouting warnings, not threats. The valley ended in a craggy hill, like many littering the broken landscape. Emerging from the brow was a monster combination of lobster, crab, and armoured centipede, but of stupendous size. It almost covered the hill over which it was clambering, its bossed shell scraping on the rock, hissing sounds issuing from its oscillating mouthparts. As it descended, a giant claw reached out to seize the escape pod, crushing it like an eggshell before dropping it again. The same claw reached for Flosken. He staggered back, struggling to maintain his footing. Yelling battle cries, the natives sent spears and arrows clattering against the shiny carapace. They were aiming at the monster's soft parts, waving eye stalks and the broad, dripping mouth that could have taken them all in one go. Stone axes hacked at the claw that was about to pick up Flosken. Chitin splintered. Purple ichor flowed and gouted. The limb was severed and lay twitching. It was incredible to Flosken that the natives could take on this gigantic, fearsome beast with their primitive weapons, and yet they were winning. 2 staring golden eyes were transfixed by arrows, a third by a spear. Hissing and screeching, the monster retreated and crawled back over the hill to whoops of victory from the four-footed warriors. Now, their attention turned to Flosken. The leader, a fierce-looking individual with fiery red hair and beard, turned to him and bellowed an order in a guttural, unintelligible language. The second quadruped dashed forward and seized Flosken, flinging him violently across his well-muscled, smock-covered back and holding him there in a vice-like grip. The whole troop turned and raced back the way it had come, knocking the breath out of Flosken with every pace. Once again, he had been snatched from the jaws of death. Once again, more likely, to face something worse. He was in the hands of aliens. Once through the valley, Flosken managed to raise his head and was able to see just how strange and dangerous a world he had come into. It was a nightmare world with its glaring sky, tumbled landscape and gigantic life forms. The crab centipede monstrosities seemed to be everywhere, ambling aimlessly in search of food. The quadrupeds managed to avoid them, but apparently there were more terrifying threats to their existence. They slowed before they had got very far, spreading out and jinking nervously. Flosken spotted what he thought at first was a factory smokestack, rearing high in the air in the distance, such as might be seen in Aurelia's industrial zone.
My first
it even belched smoke,
cars.
or perhaps it was steam, and gave off vague hooting sounds. But it was not a factory chimney. It was alive, it was flexible, and it was bending over.
Welcome to the stream.
Its reeking
Just
mouth swooping across the terrain towards
Warhammer
the troop.
audiobooks and
The quadrupeds scattered, taking cover in rock crevices. From there, Flosken watched in fascination. Briefly, he saw a ring of eyes around the chimney's circular rim as it picked off a crab centipede.
How's the
The
audio
monster
for
was
you
sucked,
guys?
struggling into the tube as it whipped upright once more, presumably to be drawn into its enormous stomach. Cautiously, the quadrupeds set off once more. Once out of reach of the stack beast, they sought high ground. Flosken was puzzled as to why they would expose themselves so, but from the vantage point of a craggy ridge he got the answer. The low ground was dotted with a terrifying type of plant-like animal, a house-sized bulb vaguely resembling a cactus, from which spread dozens of wriggling, searching tentacles radiating in every direction. Any edible animal they found was whipped back to be devoured. A quadruped, or anything roughly the size of a man, would have stood no chance trying to cross that deadly network. Flosken's mind whirled. Just how many alien horrors did this planet have to offer? Suddenly, the quadrupeds seemed out of place.
Is this any better
as if they did
for
not
you guys?
really belong here. They were like hapless insects, ready to be
I'm
picked up by
guessing-
a host of larger creatures. But he could think no more, only concentrate on the agony of his rough ride on the back of the native. Though he dreaded what awaited him, It
How
was
is that?
almost a relief when the quadruped's village
I'm not talking
came
much,
in
mainly
sight.
because I'm listening
It
to
was
the
formed
audiobook.
along a 20-foot-tall hedge bristling with thorns and sharpened stakes. At a shouted signal, a section of hedge
There
was
we go.
dragged inwards, allowing them to enter. The scene within was a tumultuous throng of four-footed aliens surging among huts.
You can hear me,
thatched
but
with
not the
crimson
audiobook.
reeds.
Okay.
A blazing fire burned in the centre of the compound, some sort of animal roasting over it on a spit. Floskin was tossed from his carrier and set on his feet,
How's
again
this?
struggling to stand against the dragging gravity. Great excitement greeted his arrival. The natives jostled with one another,
Alright.
rearing on
Testing.
their hind legs and uttering exultant cries.
Testing.
Hans grabbed Floskin and pulled him towards the fire. He shrank back,
Testing.
his face slack. Terror coursed through his every nerve. He was destined for the spit. He lost control of himself and began struggling desperately as the flames scorched his face. Suddenly, he was released. A chunk of smoking cooked meat, torn from the roasting carcass, was thrust into his hand. For all the ecstasy of relief he felt, Guardsman Floskin Horton
Perfectly
discovered that
right
he was
now.
hungry. He sniffed the meat. It smelled good. He bit, chewed, and then began to eat ravenously. The aliens cheered while he satisfied his hunger. Floskin glanced from side to side. What was in their minds? Were they toying with him? Treating him well before killing him? He had heard the primitive tribes did that. How strangely human these aliens looked, if one did not look below the waist. True, they were of fierce appearance, and were very broad set. Floskin, who thought of himself as a burly youth, felt positively slim beside them. And of course, he was as weak as a child compared with their rippling muscles. As he swallowed the last fragment of meat, the native suddenly fell silent. Their ranks parted to allow the passage of one who had emerged from a nearby hut. He walked slowly and with dignity on his forelegs. His face was crackled with age, and his hair and beard were white. He halted before Floskin, regarding him with steady eyes. Then, to the guardsman's total surprise, he spoke, not in the unintelligible
There we
local
go.
speech Floskin had heard earlier, but in a strangled version of Imperial Gothic, so that he had to repeat his question twice before he made himself understood. "Have you come to us from the Emperor?" Floskin blinked. How could these primitives on an out-of-the-way planet speak Imperial Gothic and know of the God Emperor? Aware that his life might well depend on his reply, he thought for a moment and then spoke in a clear voice. "Yes, I am a warrior of the Emperor." The elder was clearly not impressed by these words. He looked Floskin up and down. "You, warrior? Warrior has weapons. Where are yours?" Too late, Floskin realised he hardly counted as a fighting man by these native standards. He waved his arms defiantly and became theatrical. "The Emperor sent me through the sky to fight his enemies. I was cast down to this land, but lost my weapons." "Then you were defeated," the aged quadruped grunted. He beckoned. "Follow." He turned and walked with his ambling gait back to the hut. Floskin tried to follow, but after only a few steps needed to be helped by another quadruped, who put out a beefy hand to support him. Inside the hut, the elder gestured to a reed pallet on the floor. "More comfortable lying down." Thankfully, Floskin lowered himself to a sitting position. The old alien did likewise, folding both pairs of legs under him. "I am Oktar, the remembering one of our tribe. My duty is to remember the ancient histories, make sure they are not forgotten." Floskin could understand his thick accent a little better now, but the next words left him dumbfounded. "Do you bring us message from the Emperor? Is he going to take us into the Imperium and make us his children?" To Guardsman Houghton, such an idea was not only bizarre and sinister, it was also impossible. He had been raised in the Imperial cult, and his childhood beliefs had been given additional fire during his short time in the Imperial Guard. Already the Aurelian 15th Regiment had helped in the extermination of an alien race who, for a while, had shared their world with human colonists. Humans could not be expected to live indefinitely on a contaminated planet. He was grateful to the aliens for saving his life, but they were aliens. It is the Imperium of Man, no? Oktar insisted, when Floskin failed to answer. We are men. Floskin looked at the animal-like appearance of Oktar's lower body. Men have 2 legs, he burst out without thinking. You have 4. Oktar sprang to his feet, glaring angrily. We are humans with 4 legs! Seeing that he had frightened Floskin, he calmed down and seated himself again. Forgive my anger, emissary. It is right that you should probe and question. Let me explain. Our ancestors were like you, 2 legs. Like you, they traveled the sky, searching for new worlds on which to live. Instead, they crashed here and became stranded. That was many, many years ago. You have seen what sort of world this is. Where you come from, objects do not weigh very much, and one needs only 2 legs to stand up. Here, everything is heavy.
I just saved up.
Not only that, but our world is hostile to human life.
So I can.
The ancients who crashed
put
here
all the
realized that
here.
they would not survive long, but they had powerful magic, and they used this to give their children 4 legs so that they could stand up. And they gave them stronger muscles so that they could fend for themselves. By this means, our people have conquered adversity and have lived for countless generations, even though we lost the ancient magic. Surely the Emperor will be pleased with us and bring us into his family. Floskin thought hard. If there was any truth in this tale, then the quadruped's ancestors would have come from Mars. Those tech priests sent countless ships out into the galaxy during the Dark Age. And yes, they would have had the ability to alter genes in the way Oktar described as magic. But the tale was wildly improbable. How did you learn the Imperial language? Floskin asked. How do you even know the Emperor? You are not the first 2 legs to come here recently. Magson came. He wanted gemstones. In return, he gave us this. Try it on, it will help you. Oktar stood and drew aside a curtain. He brought out something made of a rubbery material. Floskin's eyes widened when he saw it. It was a heavy gravity suit, designed to make life tolerable on just such a planet as this. Magson stayed long enough for me to learn his language, Oktar continued. He told us about the Imperium, and about the Emperor, who is our god. All our legends were confirmed. We entrusted him with a petition to the Emperor, asking for his rule and guidance. That was years ago. Since then, we have been waiting for you. From the sound of it, Magson was a free trader. It was most unlikely he had even reported the existence of the quadrupeds to the authorities, let alone forwarded the petition to the Administratum on Terra. Usually, such traders heeded no one but themselves. Floskin guessed he had the explanation of Oktar's claim to be human too. Oktar was obviously highly intelligent. To have learned Imperial Gothic from a passing stranger was no mean feat. But he must have concocted the myth on hearing of the marvels of the Imperium, perhaps confusing the Imperial cult with some tribal beliefs, and so himself. I can prove what I say, Oktar added then, as if reading his thoughts. I will take you to the holy shrine of our ancestors. We will travel at night, when it is safer. Put on the cloth that takes weight away. Floskin accepted the high G suit Oktar handed to him, inspecting the runic icons on the shoulder tabs. He could see why the trader Maxon had been so ready to trade it. The suit's power was low. Also, it seemed to be damaged, no doubt ready to cut out at any time. And just the same, he pulled it on, and immediately felt relief from the crippling gravity. He stood, stretched, and smiled. His smile vanished as he remembered that he was going to have to spend the rest of his life here. Oktar left him alone to let him rest. Floskin spent the hours before darkness deep in thought. For about an hour, he became very depressed, realizing that he was never to see another human being again. Whatever life was left to him would have to be spent with these 4-footed villagers. Without them, he had no chance of survival.
I don't know anything about this. I'm just trying to get
once again, he rallied and became determined to see things through. Some said the Emperor watched over all that he thought was worthy of the title of guardsman. He would prove his mettle. He was going to have to humour Oktar for the time being. It was essential that the quadrupeds accepted him. For the time being, he switched off the high G suit to conserve its power. Besides, he needed to build up his muscles. Eventually, he would need to withstand the dreadful gravity. Night fell abruptly, like a curtain. Soon, Oktar returned and explained the journey that lay ahead. "We are going to visit the temple of the ancient relics," he said. "It is deserted now, and we shall have to travel with caution, for it lies within the territory of the enemy." "You have enemies?" Floskin replied curiously. Oktar nodded curtly.
I'm a nerd.
"The worshippers of the evil god of
My
blood.
friends were the card guys.
Once they
I
were our
was
friends,
the
but not now."
mini and painter guy.
He would say no more, and Floskin turned on the high G suit once more. Guards pulled the hedge gate open. They crept out, Oktar looking to the left and right. Within the defensive circle of the hedge, the fire was kept burning at all times, so that even at
Speaking
night
of,
the
I
village
just
had a cheerful
got
look.
a pack of
Outside was an
paintbrushes I
eerie
bought, like,
darkness,
a few
relieved by a
months ago in the
dim,
mail.
silvery light cast by massive stars, though the sky boasted no moons. Floskin soon learned that Oktar's description, "safer at night," did not mean safe. When a living tangle of hooks and barbs the size of a small armoured vehicle flew at them, Oktar proved himself a master spearman, despite his age. Instead of trying to evade the barbs, he lunged straight at them and struck home. The raving mass jerked wildly from side to side, then slumped. He had penetrated the creature's
like
tiny brain.
Not even 6.
Oktar brushed a dozen sharp hooks from his skin, ignoring the
morning.
trickling blood. "They wait around villages hoping to catch children who stray," he said. "They're not much to worry about." Oktar knew his world well. He took Floskin on a wandering route that avoided the haunts of night predators, though Floskin shivered to
I
hear
gotta
the
think
chaos of
paintbrushes,
rumbling,
I was
hissing, and
let's
clacking
go.
noises all around them. After a while,
Turn the
he
lights
evidently
on.
became dissatisfied with his companion's progress
How
and
did you
invited
find
him to climb on his back.
my stream?
With Floskin clinging to him, he set off at a tireless gallop, the great shaft of his spear resting on his shoulder. Eventually, he slowed, setting Floskin on his feet again. From then on, he proceeded carefully, sliding from cover to cover and looking carefully about him as he went. They came at last to a natural amphitheatre. At its bottom, a ruined stone temple glittered faintly in the starlight.
There we go.
Its shape was hard to make out. There was a circle
Yeah,
of
how
broken
did you
pillars,
find my
and within it
stream?
the remains of a round building, which might once have been
Or
domed.
like, how'd you know I
It
was
must
streaming?
have been thousands of years old. Alert from any savage beast, which might be using the
I've
temple
been
as a
streaming for
lair,
about 2.5
Oktar approached
hours now.
carefully, but all was
Yeah,
quiet.
2
They stepped within
hours
the
and 35
lichen-covered
minutes.
walls. The roof had long gone. Light from the star clouds streamed into the circular enclosure, revealing an unexpectedly wondrous display. Strange machines. Oktar stood in silence, allowing Floskin to take in the wondrous view. This was indeed a holy place. Floskin felt as though he had been transported to the
sorry, I
ancient,
burned my
ancient
mouth real
past,
bad
to the
earlier
dark age of
while I was eating
technology
my dinner,
and the
and
days of the cult
Kind
mechanicus.
of not like
Plainly,
to
the
talk.
machines had once been arranged with reverence so that they could be worshipped as a sacred shrine, but now they were scattered across the ruined chamber, some of them smashed to pieces, while others had simply fallen
nice.
apart. A
I'm
few,
happy that
however,
did something.
appeared to be still intact. Matte black
just listening to
surfaces gleaming,
Warhammer audiobooks
rectangular display screens
while playing the
reflecting the
game.
starlight. They were like no machines Floskin was familiar with, and their purpose was a mystery. But there was plain signs that they were designed to be operated by humans, in the form of keyboards, knobs, and slides. "The Ancient Ones from the sky came to our world with these sacred objects," Oktar told him in a hushed tone. "By these means they could work magic, though how we do not know." Presumably the quadrupeds had thought better than to reveal the shrine to the trader Magson. He would certainly have wanted to take them away with him. They represented arcane sciences superior even to those of the present-day Imperium. The shrine machines might even contain examples of standard template construction, sought throughout inhabited space. And all this meant that Oktar's claim was true. The quadrupeds were all human stock. During the 2 campaigns in which he had served, Floskin had seen abhumans. He had seen ogrons and beastmen, degenerate forms of human of low intelligence. he could not help but compare them with the noble Oktar.
I just realized
for
this
his
is a
weird
story
lower limbs,
that I remember.
He was much more
This
human
guy-
than they had been. Furthermore, the physical differences had been arranged by the arts of the ancient tech priests, not
I
left to the
remember hearing
vagaries
about
of
this one,
evolution.
so
Did they not then deserve the Emperor's recognition?
I didn't know it was on the
Yes,
playlist.
they did. While these thoughts whirled through his brain, a drumming sound came to Floskin's ears. Oktar heard it too. He capered round on all four legs, glaring, spear at the ready. "Worshippers of the blood god! We were seen, emissary! Hide yourself!" A savage roar rose up all around them. Swarming down the slope of the amphitheatre was a spear-bearing, axe-waving mob of quadrupeds, clad in scrappy animal skins or armour fashioned from the shells of the crab monsters. On their heads were helmets consisting of the emptied carapaces of smaller armoured creatures, complete with claws, or, in some cases, what appeared to be human skulls. By the silvery starlight, Floskin saw all this clearly through the gaps in the temple wall. When the quadrupeds got closer, he saw, even more clearly, why they could not be of Oktar's tribe. Their faces were tattooed, transforming them into hideous masks. The good-natured ferocity of Oktar's people was completely absent. Instead,
I
were the
just found a
bestial
YouTube
snarls,
playlist
hate-filled grimaces,
and then
and
listening to it.
blood-curdling shrieks of those bent on wanton murder and destruction.
Because I've always
Floskin
watched your
shrank back
channels,
at
but I've
first,
never actually
thinking
gotten
to hide as he had
audiobooks.
been instructed. But when he saw the old remembering one dash from the temple, apparently determined to defend the Emperor's emissary to the last, he could not help himself. He looked around for something to use as a weapon. Now, the attackers were within the circle of pillars. Oktar thrust his spear into the chest of the first to reach him, bringing the savage down. Floskin grabbed up a piece of fallen masonry,
so close.
hefting it despite its weight, and ran to his aid. Oktar had his back to one of the pillars, surrounded and sorely pressed. Floskin did not think he could throw the rock, it would simply fall from his hand. He ran forward and struck with all his might against the crab-protected head, aiming for the exposed cheekbone. The quadruped merely staggered a little and turned to give Floskin a look of outrage. Sour-smelling breath washed over Floskin from a snarling, tattooed and scarred face. He glimpsed
I
the
just got
stone
done
axe
with
flashing down
Brutal
towards
Cunning,
his skull.
because I
Then,
worked 12-hour
the
shifts.
axe was
and
miraculously stayed.
audiobook.
Another warrior had deflected it. Instead, rough hands seized him. In that same moment, sheer weight of numbers overcame the struggling Oktar, 3 spears lunging into him at once. His
I
legs
can't buy all the books I
buckling,
want to read, man.
so
It's
that
too
he was brought
expensive.
down like some magnificent animal by a yapping pack of predators. He turned piteous
Also,
eyes to
kinda
the
hard to
struggling Floskin. Tell
Do a
the
12-hour
Emperor,
shift.
we are human.
So I'm
Then
focusing,
Floskin, held
you
in
know?
a steely grip, was forced to watch in horror as with jubilant screeches the killers continued to hack and stab at the body of the remembering one, until it was nothing but a bloody mass. Eventually, leaving off their gruesome work, they turned to stare inquisitively at Floskin. As well as their elaborate tattoos, each face bore intricate tribal scars, so that it was difficult to discern any human features at all. Floskin stared straight back at the devilish masks, clenching his fists. For the moment, rage burned all the
Yeah.
fear out of him.
12 hours is
Ignorant
fun.
savages had
I
murdered a
make
brave
boxes for
worshipper
a
of the
cheese
Emperor.
factory.
If only he could deliver the full vengeance of the Imperial Guard on them. Mocking laughter arose among the quadrupeds. Did they perhaps regard him as a 2-legged cripple, an object of mirth? While this went on, something else was afoot. Roaring warriors charged into the temple and began smashing the precious ancient relics. Others collected bundles of a dry, mossy material that grew nearby, piling it over the mysterious machines. A spark was struck from 2 fragments of stone, setting the floss alight. Soon, the machines themselves were burning with a brilliant white, seething flame, forcing everyone out of the temple. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion and an enormous glare, bringing down the remains of the ruin and hurtling stone chunks into the crowd. Something amongst the machinery, perhaps long-dead fuel cells, had ignited. This turn of events seemed to scare the raiders. Floskin was dragged roughly onto a quadruped's back, and the whole pack set off with alarmed howls, scrambling up out of the amphitheatre and streaming into the darkness. The ride did not last long. The alien sun was rising when the village of the tattooed four legs
Basic.
came into sight. Like Oktar's, it was protected by a high thorn hedge, a section of which was dragged inwards to allow them to enter. Set on his feet, Floskin stared around him in fascination. There seemed to be a pattern
That's
to
a
the
big
quadruped
pack now.
settlements. Within the compound was the same circle of reed-thatched huts and a central fire. But here, the atmosphere vibrated with savagery and violence. Fighting was a way of life. Several brawls seemed to be happening at any one time. Except for females and the young, all faces were scarred and tattooed. Floskin's eyes were drawn to a huge totem pole towering over the huts near the central fire. Carved on it was a huge, crimson, maniacally glaring face, eyes bulging, teeth bared, seeming to radiate a lust for death and battle. The Blood God. Floskin was dragged into a nearby hut and tied by his hands to a rough wooden post. After his captors left, and his eyes grew
Multiplayer
accustomed
game?
to the gloom,
I think
he realised
they were
he
talking
wasn't
about
alone.
adding like an
A
actual
second
card
prisoner was slumped on
game
the
to
ground,
it,
tied
so you can
to a
actually
wooden post,
play
wearing
the actual
a
card
thick
game.
black greatcoat. It was Commissar Lemminkainen. For all his hunched, dishevelled state, crushed as he was by the excessive gravity, Commissar Lemminkainen was still formidable. His glinting steely gaze directed itself at Floskin from beneath his steel cap. Floskin realised that the heavy gravity suit hid his uniform. "I am Guardsman Horton, Commissar, from the Emperor's Vengeance," he said. "Did you desert your post, Guardsman?" Lemminkin accused in a grating voice. Then, not waiting for an answer, he added, "I, too, was on that ship. The last thing I remember is when the torpedo struck. Someone must have put me in an escape pod. I was already falling through the atmosphere when I regained my senses. My last pistol missing from its holster. Do you have yours, Guardsman?" It was a relief to Floskin that the Commissar did not remember trying to absolve a panicking trooper by executing him in the transport ship's last moments. "No, Commissar, I'm unarmed." Lemminkainen grunted. The Commissar seemed eager to
Yeah, that's my
explain his
plan.
presence on the planet.
Get XP.
Could he have thrown
also.
himself into an escape pod out of self-preservation, just as Floskin had? But then he would still have his last pistol, unless the quadrupeds had taken it from him, in which case they would have searched Floskin for one too, so he had to be telling the truth. Floskin felt ashamed to have doubted him. Lemminkainen was frowning at him, perhaps puzzled to see him in a HG suit. "Did anyone but ourselves escape the battle?" he asked sharply. Floskin shook his head. "Not as far as I know. The entire flotilla was destroyed. The Aurelian 15th is gone." A sob came into his voice. "I may be the only one left, and no one even knows where in space we came out of the warp." "You are an ignorant young fool, Guardsman. We are deep inside a planetary system. Ships cannot emerge from the warp this close to a star, except by means of a known and charted warp gate. The Navy will be here to investigate when the flotilla fails to arrive. Not that you will benefit from it. We are in the hands of aliens of the most savage and perverted type. In the next few hours, they will torture us to death. You were lucky to have me with you. I will help you face the end with fortitude, keeping your faith in the Emperor." Floskin gulped, impressed though he was by Lemminkainen's steadfastness. "Are you sure, Commissar?" he whispered. "Of course I am sure. Have you seen that type outside? I've seen that same imagery in half a dozen worlds. It is the emblem of a chaos god, the god of slaughter and destruction. These aliens are its devotees." "The Blood God," Floskin murmured. "That's what they call it." "Then you've heard of it too? Yes, the Blood God. That's what it is called all across the galaxy." "But surely the Emperor is the only true god." Floskin had heard stories about the Chaos Gods in Australia, but he had taken them to be fanciful superstitions. The Commissar's words sounded strange to him. "The Emperor is the only true god, but the Chaos Gods are real too,"
I've only been
Lemminkainen assured him.
And
"They oppose the Emperor.
I just hired a
and are
guy
responsible for every
so I can
evil
actually start
and
opening. I'm
depravity.
at level 19
Here we have two enemies of the Emperor together,
on
aliens
on day
and
40.
the Chaos God." Floskin could not contain himself. "These people are not aliens, Commissar. They are human," he cried out, "and some of them worship the Emperor." In a rush of words, he related everything that had happened since he was deposited on the planet, his rescue from the crab monster, the gift of a high G suit, how Oktar had proved his claim to be human. The Commissar listened closely, growing more and more astounded. Standard template, he breathed in excitement. Are you sure it is all destroyed? There can't be anything left after the fire and the explosion. We shall see. Floskin was not really concerned. Will good tribes like Oktar's be admitted into the Imperium? He asked eagerly. After all, there are plenty of other abhumans. Lemoncanon's voice rose in impassioned fury. How many times must I tell you that you are a fool, Guardsman? Ogrins and the like are natural human types. A human being with 4 legs is an abomination. It is a mutant, and a mutant is a child of chaos. It cannot be allowed to live. His voice fell to an exhausted drone. It is a good thing we have discovered this. We must try to leave a record for the investigators. There is nothing here but twisted human mutation and the taint of chaos. My report will recommend the cleansing of this entire planet. Floskin sank into an appalled silence. Had the quadrupeds been listed as aliens, they would have been left alone. The Imperium did not exterminate every alien race in the galaxy, meritorious though it was, but now he had doomed them to extinction. The heavy gravity was clearly too much for Lemoncanon. His frenzied speech seemed to have exhausted what was left of his strength. He fell into a fitful doze. Floskin was almost sorry he could not give him the high G soup for a while. The worshippers of the Blood God did not seem to be in any hurry. After several hours, the crew dawned on a bearded, tattooed quadruped, smelling like a goat and wearing a jerkin made from the bristling porcupine-like skin, entered and raised a bowl of water to Floskin's lips. Glancing at the sleeping Commissar, he merely grunted and went out again. The next time the door opened, a throng of leering, mocking faces crowded around the opening, then drew aside to reveal the results of the morning's work. It was a large, oval container.
Hey, that's my second highest card I've ever drawn.
Floskin easily recognised it for what it was. An oven, able to take 2 men inside it. Beneath it was a fireplace, already piled with wood. Leering laughter greeted the look on Floskin's face as he stared at the thing. He and the Commissar were going to be baked alive. The closing door shut out grimacing faces. Shortly, it began to grow dark again. The brief day was ending, and outside it was growing quiet as the worshippers of the Blood retired to their huts. Floskin could guess that the grisly death rite, undoubtedly a sacrifice to their foul blood god, was scheduled for the next day. Leaning, trembling against the post to which he was tied, he began thinking with terror of the excruciating death which was shortly to come upon him. Then he started thinking of his comrades of the Aurelian 15th, who had suffered hardly less painful deaths on the Emperor's vengeance. Some had been personal friends, back in his home district of Aurelia.
Yeah, that was my
shaking.
second highest card.
Resolve formed in him. He owed a duty to his dead
My
comrades,
first highest
to his
card
superior
was like
officer, Commissar
$60,
Lemoncanon, and a debt of gratitude to Oktar
until just
and his
until
people.
like
He
just
had
recently,
to
I
change
just got like a
Lemoncanon's mind
$600
about them,
card,
and above all, he wished to avoid
and then
the
that's a
Clay
$100 card. So that's
all
my
day,
second
Floskin had
highest.
been working on his bonds, with little effect. Now an idea came to him. The high G suit had metal ribs with squared off edges. He worked the braided cord to one of these and began to rub. It was slow work, but in the end his patience was rewarded. The hut was in near darkness when he had worn down the cord enough so that he could break it. Finally, he stood unfettered and glanced at the sleeping form of Commissar Lemoncanon.
Yeah, I
considered
kind of am
trying to
on
take the
when it comes
Commissar
to
with
these
him
types of things,
before
which is
realising
why
that it
I
would be
don't
impossible.
actually
Lemoncanon's
play
only
card
hope,
games,
and it remained a faint one, was for Floskin to bring help.
because I just have that
He slipped from the hut,
unlucky luck.
moving with the stealth of a shadow, as he
I
had
have that
expected the
Spider-Man
village was
luck,
sleeping,
you know?
with sentinels
It's
posted
like whenever
atop
you
the
want to
hedge
score bad,
fortifications.
I'll score high,
But he
and
spotted
whenever I want
those
to
too,
score
and
high,
neither
I'll
was
score
looking
bad.
his way. Floskin sidled to the hedge. The foot-long thorns made it perfectly easy to scale, and in moments he was over the top and down the other side. Crouching, he took stock. Tonight, the sky was cloudy, and few stars were visible. Of the terrain, there were only vague humps in the darkness. Still, he thought he could remember which way to go. He pulled at one of the sharpened stakes, which made the hedge bristle. It came out easily. Now he had a weapon. Silently, Imperial Guardsman Horton lopped off into the lightless unknown, intent on retrieving the honour of the Aurelian 15th. All that night,
I don't know.
Floskin travelled,
Like,
trying not to stray from his chosen direction,
I guess, like
trying
boxes.
to suppress his fright. Clicking, buzzing, rattling noises sounded all around him. All too often, he thought he felt a chill touch, a claw, a feeler, a rasp, a feathery antenna, causing him to lash out with the stake in a sideways swipe or jab
See,
with
how
the
many
point,
packs do I have?
often followed by the sound of something
I've
scuttling
made
away.
16
Dawn found him
of those
weary.
100 card
Something
packs.
else found him too. He first became aware of it as a sharp, acid smell. And then it charged from behind a rock to attack him. It was about twice the size of a horse, but in appearance like a cockroach, whose head was a mass of razor-sharp sword blades sliding in and out with a scything sound, rubbing against one another. At their full extent, they were as long as his stake. He took a lesson from
Why do I have
Oktar.
12
To
satisfy
retreat was
customers?
death, therefore attack. He ran at the animal, which in turn was scurrying towards him, eager to slice him to bits with its battery of blades.
Boxes.
Go for the brain.
Fine,
Oktar had taught him that too.
fine.
A bubbling, whistling noise came from the creature as he pushed the stake in as hard as he could. Then it turned on its back, a dozen stubby legs waving in death agony. As he withdrew the stake, from which a purple goo dripped, a sensation of irresistible weight seized him. He looked at the icons and groaned. The high G suit had lost power. Floskin sank to his knees. Where was the village? The creature was but the first and smallest of the monsters that were likely to find him. Others would be gigantic, impossible to fight even with a fully functioning high G suit. Abandoning the stake, he was reduced to crawling on all fours as his own weight settled on him, dragging him into a pit of
Everyone's
despair.
grabbing these.
Soon, even this was too much. He was forced to lie down and close his eyes in exhaustion. The sound of a human voice awoke him with a start. A quadruped stood over him, clad in a cloth tunic, lacking facial scars and tattoos, and with no claw-bearing helmet. One of Oktar's people. Floskin struggled to sit up. Had he made it out of the territory of the Blood God, or were the Remembering One's tribe looking for him after he had failed to return? Oktar is dead. Blood God. They have messenger from the Emperor. Going to kill him. Floskin pleaded. Had Oktar been the only one to understand Imperial Gothic? Had he taught it to any of the others? The quadruped looked at him, frowning. Blood God, Emperor. Blood God, kill Emperor. Yes, help, Emperor. For the first time he noticed a large curved horn hanging from the foreleg's neck. The tribesman raised it to his lips and blew a long, winding blast. More warriors appeared among the crags and began making their way down to them. Floskin's guess seemed to have been correct. They were searching for Oktar and must have already been to the destroyed
Full
temple.
art foil
The
ghost
quadruped
card.
with the horn began bellowing commands, flinging out his arm in the direction Floskin had indicated. In moments, a small horde was
Dang it.
racing for the village of the Blood God.
Sick
A
of
hand came down, helping Floskin up and onto a sturdy back. Heart
What was he
exultant, he hung on for all his
Right.
worth and
Big
realised
box.
that his limbs no longer seemed so heavy. Glancing at the high G icons, he grinned. The suit's photoelectric strips had been soaking up sunlight. The high G field was re-energised. For ferocity, the assault on the village would have done the Imperial Guard credit. Taken by surprise, the devotees of the Blood God forayed through the gate at first, attempting to defend their settlement outside its bounds, but they were soon driven back. The attacking warriors swarmed up over the hedge and down into the compound, climbing it as Floskin had. He mounted it too and watched from the top
Full foil
as
ghost
axes
card.
rose and fell,
Sounds like something I
spears
need to
jabbed,
get.
blood flowed. The Blood God's followers were fighting for their homes, fighting for their lives, fighting for
Can't
their
expand
savage god,
yet.
and they laid about them as if demented, their bestial roars filling the air. But Oktar's people were fighting for a god too, the Emperor. It was hard to say who would be the victor at this stage. It was as if the
So
butchery
close,
would
come on.
continue until there was almost no one left. Floskin chose his moment to drop into the compound and dodge his way to the prison
I'm
hut
going to get those
near
better
the newly
cards
constructed
so I can
oven,
expand
which he
this
was glad
room.
to see had not been used yet.
Plans to put
In the dim
cards here,
interior,
cards
Lamakainen
here,
looked at him
and just
in wonderment.
expand.
He did not even speak as the guardsman untied him and helped him to his feet, supporting
Yay!
his weight.
Alright, black.
"We have been
red,
rescued,
yellow.
Commissar," Floskin yelled, "by four-legged men who are loyal to the Emperor. Did I not tell you?" Lamankainen's response was a look of sour disbelief and an emphatic shake of his head. Nevertheless, he allowed Floskin to guide him gingerly
Yellow
to
and
the
blue.
door. There, an extraordinary sight met their eyes. The fighting had all but stopped. Something had wrapped itself around the village. It was like a millipede, many hundreds of paces long, which had coiled around the circular hedge wall, though it overtopped it by nearly half its height. Again. From each of its countless segments sprouted a pair of tentacles tipped with eyes, lashing down into the compound to pick up defenders and attackers alike, whipping them over the hedge to be devoured. Perhaps the smell of blood from the battle had attracted it. The spectacle seemed to send Lamankainen into a frenzy. He pushed Floskin away from him and staggered through the doorway, forcing himself to stand erect.
Someone buy that green.
"I must make my report. Order the exterminatus. Guardsman, if I am martyred, you must deliver this into the right hands." From within his greatcoat he whipped out a flat grey plate with a keypad. It was his personal log. Feverishly he began typing, oblivious of what went on around him. "Look out, Commissar!" Floskin lunged to knock the Commissar aside, but it was too late. A slithering tentacle had seized him, pinning his arms to his body. With barely a heard gurgle, Lamankainen was gone. Floskin snatched up the
Full
log
art
plate as
blood.
it fell to the dusty ground, nimbly avoiding a flailing tentacle
know.
as he did so.
I don't know. what
By
that
now,
was,
the
that
tribesmen
pack
were
yet.
dealing with the millipede in their own fashion. They had set the hedge alight, but so intent was the beast on its feeding
How come I-
that it ignored the flames until it was too late. It too caught fire, writhing soundlessly, crushing huts in its
Oh.
agony, while an
that's why.
indescribably foul-smelling smoke filled the air. Everything in the village was burning now. Everything was being flattened as the blazing monster flexed and rolled, forcing villagers and invaders to flee as one for the exit or trample their way through the glowing cinders of the collapsing hedge. The battle forgotten. Floskin too was caught up in the stampeding rush. Out in the open, the two sides drew apart, glaring at one another. It was doubtful if they even remembered
Everyone I've watched
they
like
were
can't
fighting
sell the
over,
ghost cards, like,
but they
no
were
one will
ready
buy
to
them.
begin again. Then
Also, until
a
you
grunting
level up,
movement
there's like
behind
no
the air
point in
made
selling them,
Floskin
you know?
look up. His heart leapt. His prayer to the Emperor was answered. All around Floskin, four-legged men dropped to their knees. A large, shining metal shape was descending. It was an Imperial shuttlecraft. The Aurelian 15th sole survivor handed this in, sir. It appears that Commissar Lamankainen was making his last report when he was killed. In his brass-ornamented cabin, Captain Gert Leider, commander of the battleship Ravenger, took the Commissar's data slate from his officer's hand. He noticed that the log was not closed. Lamankainen had not even had time to finish the report or key in his code. He tapped a key and began to read. Emergency report by Commissar Lamior Lamankainen, LX/38974B, on unnamed planet in cluster FR/7891, in vicinity of Warp Gate 492. This planet is of no value to the Imperium. It is a feral world of the most extreme violence and would be very difficult to colonize. It contains a primitive, semi-intelligent alien species unlikely to advance further. Recommend no action, particularly on account of. There, it ended. Who is the survivor? Captain Gert Leider asked. Just a regular guardsman, sir. He was with Commissar Lamankainen to the end. He appears to have acquitted himself well in difficult circumstances. I shall recommend his promotion when he is reassigned. The captain handed back the data slate. Very well. See that this is passed on to the administrator. Down in the crew quarters of the Ravenger, Guardsman Floskin Hartoon was feeling very nervous indeed. Once aboard the battleship, he had contrived to be alone for a while. He could not resist taking a look at Commissar Lamankainen's open log. Lemminkainen had opened the log using his personal code, but had got no further than the heading, stating time and place. The millipede creature had eaten him at that point. So Floskin, appalled at his own audacity, had made an entry of his own. He couldn't close the entry, of course, since he didn't know Lemminkainen's code, so he had left it in mid-sentence, hoping that made it look all the more authentic. He dreaded to think what would become of him if it was ever discovered that he had made a false entry in the commissar's log. But he had realised that neither Lemminkainen nor any other agent of the Administratum would ever look favourably on the quadrupeds once their human ancestry was known. Now, mutants are mutants. They had altered themselves too much. Well, now they would be registered as aliens and left alone. Floskin had already heard that Warp Gate 492 was to be marked as unusable on the charts, a deadly trap now that it had been discovered by the Orcs, who must have been lurking nearby waiting for Imperial vessels to emerge. The planet would receive no more visitors. For the 100th time, he wondered if it was true that the Emperor saw everything. Did he know what Floskin had done, and did he approve or abhor Floskin for it? Floskin took it as a good sign that no one had questioned why he was wearing a high-G suit. A war between good and evil was shaping up on the quadruped's planet. He hoped, of course, that the Blood God could be defeated, but whatever the outcome, it was going to be settled by the quadrupeds themselves, though sadly, outside of the family of man.
Good. Hey, if you want to stop by or check out my
Thank
channel,
you
I am
all very
building
much for watching.
a
If you wouldn't
life-size
mind giving
Death
this video
Guard
a
power
like, I'd really appreciate that. Please
Right now it's
subscribe
at
if you're not
like 9.5
subscribed,
feet
and hit
tall.
the bell so you get notified when I post a video or go live
If you ever want to check
stream
that out.
on something. This was
But
an odd one.
Thank you for joining me.
Because clearly, this guy should have said, nah, the mutants need to die. There's like fragments of STC technology on this planet which can like unbelievably help the Imperium. But he's decided that four-legged mutants, I don't know. I can understand why you would think that, but I don't think he's seen the big picture. If you would like to support the channel and the stuff I do here, please consider using the links below, like these good gentlemen have here. Thank you very much, lads. Really appreciate your support. And if anyone would like to join them, like I say, there's links in the description below. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. Cheers.
Alright, I think this will be a good place to stop as well, actually. Yeah, I think I'm going to be ending it. I've been streaming for 3 hours. Yeah, I'm going to be heading off. Ah. I know I just got a new card. What was it? Yeah! 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 Few $100 if I sell it. Yay! Should I sell it? That'll be for next time. I think I'm gonna save. And I think I'm gonna quit for the night. thanks for joining me. See y'all next time. If I don't stream this game, I'll probably stream some 3D prints. Live stream that. Yay! Live stream me doing some 3D printing, and probably some more audiobooks. You know, it's all fun. Thanks for joining me. Like, subscribe, and share, please. Help me grow the channel and do more massive projects like this giant Death Guard I'm building. Bye. Do 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 do.